I've always believed that silence could stitch a man back together, the way a clean thread pulls torn fabric into something almost whole again. That belief is what dragged me to a nearly forgotten corner of South Brooklyn, an abandoned textile factory chopped into cheap artist lofts, the kind of place people only choose when they're broke, lost, or running from a version of themselves they can't face in daylight. I, unfortunately, happened to be all three. The building sat like a rusted relic between warehouses and half-hearted construction sites. I convinced myself it was exactly what I needed. No noise, no neighbors pounding on walls, no memories shoved into my chest like a fist. Just space where I could paint again, maybe reclaim a piece of my life I had steadily dismantled. The loft itself was bare bones, concrete floors, exposed beams, a single cracked window, overlooking a loading dock. It should have felt empty, but to me it felt like a reset button, a place where no one knew the things I'd said, the things I'd thrown, the way Elena had looked at me, the night everything fell apart. The manager, Clifford, was a wide-shouldered guy with a smoker's rasp and a habit of finishing sentences with a shrug. He promised quiet, said the walls were thick, said most tenants kept to themselves. But the first night, as I lay on my mattress staring up at the pipes webbing the ceiling, I heard it a soft, barely, their sobbing that slipped through the concrete like water, through fabric. It was so faint I thought maybe it came from inside my own skull. But then, something fragile, cracked, like glass under pressure, and I sat straight up, heart hammering, ears straining. The next morning I confronted Clifford. He kept insisting it was the factory settling, whatever that meant. Old pipes, temperature changes, nothing human, nothing I needed to worry about. I tried to believe him, but silence has always been the cruelest judge. It doesn't lie, it only waits, until you're still enough to hear the truth you've been avoiding. And that night, the sobbing returned clearer this time, threaded with fear, a fear I recognized far too well. I told myself it was just a neighbor. But deep down, something colder whispered otherwise, because I knew that sound. I had heard it once before from Elena, from me. In the days that followed, the building felt less like a home and more like a pressure chamber. The lofts were arranged in a row, thin concrete slabs dividing strangers, yet the hallways were eerily empty. No footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of ancient machinery that should have been shut off decades ago. But every night, without fail, the sobbing returned. Sometimes it was only a wet sniff, like someone trying to stifle their grief. Other times it grew into a trembling plea, a voice scraped raw from begging, and always, always, came the sound of something shattering porcelain, glass, maybe memories. I tried to track the rhythm of it. At 1:14 a.m., the crying started. At 1:19, the whispering began, words I couldn't quite make out. By 1:27, the breaking sound echoed through the wall to my right, the studio next door. I hammered my fist against it one night, desperate to shut it up. "Hey, you okay over there?" The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was surgical, stiff and wrong. I thought someone might answer. No one did. The next morning I knocked on the neighbor's door, but the unit looked untouched, dust layering, the door handle like a forgotten relic. Clifford swore no one lived there. Said the pipes were creating audio illusions, something about pressure pockets and echoes. He chuckled when I insisted the sounds were human. "City will mess with your head if you let it," he said. "Let the building settle." He walked off before I could argue, but I wasn't imagining it. I know the difference between a pipe expanding and a person breaking. I've caused the latter before. When I finally set up my canvas and tried to paint, my hands shook. Colors refused to blend the way they used to. Every brushstroke felt like a lie. Eventually, the frustration boiled over, and I slammed my palette against the wall, creating a smear that looked disturbingly like a tear streak. To prove I wasn't losing it, I started recording the nights. I set my phone beside the bed, screen dimmed, microphone pointed toward the wall. At sunrise, I'd play the recording back. The first playback chilled me. It captured a woman's voice whispering, "Please don't." A sob, a crack, then barely audible, "Please don't throw it." My stomach turned. I'd heard those exact words before, because they were the last thing Elena said to me before I hurled the vase. The storm rolled in on a Thursday evening, thunder crawling over the rooftops like a warning. I couldn't paint, couldn't eat, couldn't sit without hearing that recording loop in my mind. The voice wasn't perfect, but the cadence, the hesitation, the way the breath hitched, felt too real, too familiar. Guilt does strange things. It doesn't just weigh you down. It rearranges the world to reflect your worst truths. By midnight, the walls were pulsing with noise again. The sobbing grew louder than ever, trembling like someone cornered. I couldn't take it. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped into the dark hallway, and marched to the studio next door. The knob twisted easily. The door swung open with a reluctant groan. The room was empty. Not someone just moved out. Empty, more like no one had lived there. For decades, dust coated the floor in an unbroken sheet. The windows were boarded shut. No mattress, no broken glass, no sign of life. But my phone, still in my hand, continued playing last night's recording. And beneath the static was that same voice. Please don't throw it. Please don't. My knees nearly buckled. I swept the flashlight across the room, half expecting shadows to move. Instead, I found a wall of old water stains, shaped like reaching arms. I backed away, a metallic taste filling my mouth. My mind began restitching memories I tried for months to bury. Elena cowering behind our coffee table, tears streaking down her face, me standing over her with anger boiling out of my chest like steam. I told myself it wasn't as bad as she made it sound. Told myself she exaggerated. Told myself everyone fights. But deep down, I knew. She begged. I threw the vase anyway. I stumbled out of the empty unit and slammed the door. The hallway lights flickered. The building groaned like something waking up. When I reached my loft, her silhouette stood at the edge of my peripheral vision, small, trembling, like she had been that night. Every time I blinked, she shifted closer. By 3 a.m., I had pulled every mirror off my walls. Seeing my own reflection felt like staring at the flux. Man she feared. The building wasn't haunted. I was. The days blurred after that. I slept on the floor with the lights on. I stopped painting altogether. Bottles accumulated in a lopsided row along the counter. I told myself the alcohol would soften the edges of the sounds, but it only sharpened them. Everything in the building began whispering. The hum of the old generators carried her faint pleas. The elevator's wheezing echoed her sobs. Even the dripping pipe near my window felt timed to her shallow breaths. When I played the newest recording, the voice had changed. It was no longer begging. It was confronting. Why did you do it? The faint voice whispered. Why did you pretend it wasn't real? I threw the phone across the loft so hard it cracked against the wall. But even lying face down, the audio continued. Her breathing filled the room. My own guilt had grown teeth. One night, as rain hammered against the windows, I felt a presence behind me, heavy, expectant. I didn't dare turn around. Her silhouette had been showing up in the corners of my eyes for days. When I exhaled, the air behind me stirred as if someone were leaning close. Sebastian. My name drifted through the room like a draft through a broken window. I spun so fast I nearly slipped. No one was there. But the smell of Elena's lavender lotion, something I hadn't been near in months, hung in the air. Reality buckled. I sank to the floor, hands shaking violently. I'm sorry, I whispered. I know what I did. The room answered with the soft clink of glass. My fallen palette had crushed a jar of solvent, and the shards scattered in a starburst. For a moment, it looked like a reenactment of that night, the broken vase, the broken trust. The moment I crossed a line, I had no right stepping near. I tried to remind myself this was just trauma echoing through an empty building. But guilt doesn't follow logic, it follows conscience, and mine had finally turned on me. On the 5th week, the building fell silent, not peaceful, but anticipatory, like a held breath. No crying, no breaking sounds, no whispers tracing the pipes. That terrified me more than anything. Silence meant it was my turn to speak. I sat in the middle of the loft, legs crossed, staring at the cracked phone I'd been avoiding. I pressed play one last time. The recording didn't start with sobbing. It started with my own voice, angry, slurred, ugly. Words I had forgotten I said, but hearing them now made my skin crawl. Stop overreacting. You make everything dramatic. It's just a vase, for God's sake. Then Elena's breathless plea. Please don't throw it. And the shatter. I had recorded myself. Not here. Months ago. During our last fight I must have accidentally hit record, while grabbing my phone in the chaos. The playback wasn't the building. It wasn't a ghost. It was my past. My own violence had followed me. The moment the truth settled, a crushing weight lifted. Not relief, more like acknowledgement, the first step toward whatever came next. I called Elena. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't ask her to come back. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just told the truth. I'm getting help, I said. And I'm sorry for every moment I made you feel unsafe. You were right to leave. My voice trembled, but it didn't break. For once, I let myself feel the full shape of what I'd done, not a distorted version, not a convenient edit, the truth. When I hung up, the building remained still. No cries, no whispers, no shattering, just me. And the beginning of accountability. The loft wasn't haunted. It never had been. The only thing screaming was the part of me I'd die. Spent years denying the part capable of harm, the part that needed to learn control, the part that needed to change. For the first time in months, I opened a blank canvas. The silence was still there. But now, it wasn't accusing. It was waiting. It was mine to fill with something better. You cannot outrun the harm you cause. Guilt isn't a ghost, it's a reminder, pushing you to confront your actions, take responsibility, and become someone who will never repeat them. True healing begins when you stop hiding from your own reflection and start rebuilding the parts of yourself that hurt others. I used to believe time could dilute fear the way rain thins out old paint on a wooden fence. But fear doesn't fade. It waits. It settles into the cracks, leaks into the grain, and keeps its shape until the moment you come back. That was the lesson that greeted me the day I returned to Crestfield, Ohio, carrying more boxes of unresolved memories than luggage. I drove 12 hours to face a house I had spent decades trying to forget, telling myself I had grown, that the nightmare belonged to a child who saw monsters where there were none. Yet the closer I got to my childhood home, the louder that old memory breathed, like someone I hadn't noticed riding in the backseat the entire trip. The house looked smaller than I remembered, as if time had chewed away at its edges. The backyard where everything began felt even smaller. The fence, once towering and imposing, barely reached my shoulders now. But the memory towered over everything. The tall, stick-thin man with one milky eye staring at me from the other side. My father swore it had been a shadow, warped by dusk. I spent years trying to swallow that lie, but it never went down smooth. Inside the house, dust settled like a second skin. I opened windows, sorted through old mail, and tried to make the place livable for the short stay I'd promised myself. But restlessness made me wander into the attic before sunset. That was where I found the sketch folded, yellowed, and drawn in a trembling hand that I recognized instantly as my own. It showed the thin man, his bony fingers reaching through the kitchen window. I felt a cold pulse of childhood terror, the kind that doesn't ask permission before returning. When night fell, the motion sensor lights outside flickered in lazy, uneven gasps. A raccoon, I thought. Old wiring, maybe. But the streaks of fresh mud under the back door didn't look like something an animal would leave. They formed long handprints, dragged downward as though someone had pressed their fingers against the door and slowly pulled them to the ground. I stood there longer than I should have, my throat tightening, my heart tapping out warnings. I told myself it was nothing. I had to believe that, or I wouldn't get through the night. The next morning, I installed a small security camera overlooking the yard. I needed reassurance more than footage. Still, the camera felt like a flimsy shield against the feeling that something old, something unfinished, was stretching awake around me. I tried focusing on clearing the house, boxing up papers, tossing out junk. It felt mechanical, like I was on autopilot. But every quiet moment tugged me back to that fence, that memory, that eye. By afternoon, the house smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by open boxes when my phone buzzed with a notification from the new camera. Motion detected. I opened the feed. Nothing. The yard sat still, the fence casting long shadows across the grass, but I heard breathing, a slow, heavy exhale right behind the microphone. I muted the audio, telling myself the device was glitching. My nerves were still rattling when my older brother Nathan called. We hadn't spoken in months, and his voice sounded worn, strained in ways that caught me off guard. After some awkward, small talk, he said something that cracked the veneer I'd been trying to hold together. He told me the night our mother screamed all those years ago wasn't what Dad claimed. There had been an intruder, a real one, not a shadow, not a trick of the fence. Dad had made them bury the truth, not the man. Hide what really happened. What did you see? I asked. Nothing, Nathan whispered. But Dad did, and Mom did, and you saw more than any of us. His voice shook, and he told me he'd been having dreams, the same ones I'd been having. Since coming back, thin arms in the dark, a pale face leaning through a window. The dreams didn't feel like dreams anymore. They felt like memories resurfacing through the cracks. I didn't sleep that night. Every reflection in the house seemed to shimmer with possibility, as if someone else was waiting on the other side of the glass for me to blink. And once I blinked, they'd move closer. The third day felt different the moment I woke. The air was heavier, colder, as though the house itself had exhaled during the night and didn't inhale again. I walked through the room slowly, studying every corner like I expected something to step out. The house had always creaked and settled, but today, each noise felt purposeful, like footsteps shifting just out of sight. I tried distracting myself by exploring the basement, a place I avoided as a kid. The bulb flickered when I pulled the chain, casting jittery shadows across the concrete floor. Shelves of old paint cans and rusted tools lined the walls. In the far corner, behind a stack of broken chairs, I spotted a shallow indentation in the floor barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. A hairline crack ran through the cement, as though something beneath it had shifted years ago. I knelt beside it, tracing the crack with my finger. A sudden memory flickered behind my eyes. Dad down there late one night, covered in sweat, muttering to himself while tools clattered. I remembered standing at the top of the stairs, watching him refill the crack with fresh cement, while Mom begged him to stop. I hadn't thought of that moment in years. When I stood, a figure flashed in my peripheral vision, thin, elongated, standing at the edge of the basement stairs. I spun, heart pounding, but no one was there, only shadows stretching across the wall. But the shape lingered in my mind, too specific to be imagination. Upstairs, the reflection started changing. At first it was subtle, a darker outline behind me in the bathroom mirror, a faint movement in the glass of the oven door. I would turn around and find the room empty. Yet every time I faced a reflection again, the figure appeared closer, clearer, more familiar. By evening, exhaustion had settled into my bones. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at my trembling hands. I whispered the name that had been circling in my dreams, the name I didn't know I knew, Avery. The moment it left my lips, the walls around me seemed to shift, as if someone pressed an ear to the other side to listen. I realized then that the man I feared wasn't a stranger. Somewhere along the way, I had begun to mirror him, his stillness, his silence, his presence lingering where it didn't belong. That thought kept me awake long into the night. As the hallway lights clicked off one by one in slow succession, I tried leaving the next morning. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked out to the car, with the determined stride of someone who'd made up his mind. But when I sat in the driver's seat, I couldn't turn the key. My hands froze, my breath stalled. Something in my head whispered that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I understood what really waited behind that fence all those years ago. I forced myself back into the house, anger flaring at my own paralysis. I went straight to the backyard. The autumn grass brushed my ankles as I approached the fence. It still felt taller in my memory, looming, oppressive. I pressed my hand against the wood, cold, solid, ordinary. Then the wind shifted, and a soft scraping sound came from the other side. I stepped back. The fence groaned slowly, as if someone were leaning against it from the far side. I called out, voice trembling. No answer. Just another scrape, deliberate and slow. I grabbed a rake from the shed and pushed aside the bushes along the fence line. There, half buried near the base of the old maple tree, I found something I didn't expect. A second sketch, my own handwriting on the back, dated the year everything happened. The drawing showed the thin man not outside the house, but inside it, standing in the hallway, standing behind a small boy who looked exactly like me. My breath faltered. I didn't remember drawing that. I didn't remember knowing the man had ever been inside. I took the sketch back inside and set it on the kitchen table. The house seemed to react, settling, in loud, cracking pops. The air felt electric, charged. I heard footsteps upstairs, light, careful, deliberate. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept up the staircase, telling myself it was just old plumbing or shifting wood, but at the top of the stairs, in the reflection of the hallway mirror, I saw him again, tall, frail, one cloudy eye. But this time, I also saw something else. He had my posture, my shoulders, my face beneath the distortion, and for the first time, I understood this wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. This was inheritance, a reflection of what I had carried inside me for years, a shadow I had tried so hard to outrun that I didn't notice it growing taller behind me. The last night came quietly, almost mercifully. The house had stopped pretending to settle. Every sound felt intentional. Every breath I took felt echoed by another breath, not belonging to me. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching the walls, the old photographs, the remnants of a life that felt borrowed. The lights dimmed one by one behind me, as though the house was ushering me forward. I ended up in the backyard again around midnight. The sky was moonless, thick with clouds. The motion sensor lights flickered to life, then died, then glowed faintly, as if struggling under a weight. I stood at the fence where it had all begun, waiting. No footsteps, no scraping, just a stillness so deep it felt alive. But then I saw it, my own shadow stretched across the ground in front of me, elongated, unnaturally, distorted in ways the faint light shouldn't have been able to create. It stood taller than me, thinner, one side of its face warped as if the eye had melted into a milky blur. I stepped back, shaking. The shadow stepped forward, my chest tightened, and the truth finally opened inside me like a cracked floor giving way. The intruder wasn't a stranger buried by my father's lies. The intruder wasn't a ghost lingering in the attic or behind the fence. The intruder had been the version of me shaped by fear, silent, withdrawn, watching the world from the edges. The man I saw back then was real, but the shadow I had carried became something else, something I had fed with decades of dread. The more I feared him, the more I resembled him. The more I tried to forget him, the closer he stood. In the end, he didn't come back. I had become him. I don't remember falling, only waking in the grass hours later, the night gone, the sky pale with morning. The shadow was gone, but something inside me remained hollowed out, as though the part of me that still believed in innocence had finally stepped away. I locked the house and drove until the town vanished behind me. Some houses don't need ghosts. They just need memories that never learned how to stay buried. Unfaced fears don't disappear. They grow, taking the shape of the person who runs from them. Only by confronting the past directly can we stop becoming the shadows we fear most. I always thought losing time was something that happened to other people, soldiers, trauma, survivors, anyone with dramatic life stories. But that morning, during an ordinary budget review, meeting at my downtown Chicago office, it happened to me. I blinked and suddenly, I was standing, my chair toppled over, people staring, voices shouting my name, and a conference table that seemed to have moved 3 feet. Security guards rushed in, and before I could say a word, they were dragging me through the glass doors of the building. "Marcus, this can't keep happening," my supervisor whispered as we passed the reception. Her voice carried a mixture of fear and frustration. "HR wants you to see someone. A therapist." I tried laughing it off, but it sounded hollow, brittle even to my own ears. That evening, I found myself in a small office smelling of chamomile tea, across from Dr. Jocelyn Albright. Her calm was disarming, almost dangerous in its patience. "What's the last thing you remember before the meeting?" she asked. I told her about a flash of broken glass, a revolving door spinning too fast, and a young man humming a song I couldn't place. She leaned forward, her hands folded on her desk. "Marcus, something is trying to surface." The words clung to me all night like smoke. I kept replaying the humming, trying to attach it to a memory, but it remained just out of reach. Something in me knew it wasn't random. Something in me feared it. She asked me to sketch anything I saw in my mind: faces, objects, flashes of movement. I hadn't drawn since college, but the charcoal remembered my hands. At first, it was just vague, shapes, blurred faces, jagged lines, shadows that didn't belong anywhere. But the more I drew, the clearer he became, a young man with a dented temple and a hesitant smile, the one from my flash. Then one morning, I woke to find my fingers coated in charcoal dust. I hadn't touched the sketchbook since the night before. On the bathroom mirror, written in frantic strokes, was a message. "You already know." My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe I'd written it in a sleep-induced haze, but the handwriting wasn't mine, too chaotic, too emotional. Commuting to work, I saw him everywhere. Train windows, elevator reflections, a polished delivery truck. Each time, the humming grew louder. I returned to Dr. Albright with a box I'd found in my closet. Inside lay a scarf, soft, dark, stained with hardened brown blood. She looked at me, carefully. "Marcus, the police have been consulting me. There's a cold case. Your boyfriend, Leo. He disappeared 2 years ago." The room tilted. My stomach dropped. Recognition hit like ice water. Detective Reyes came later. She laid an evidence photo on the table. Leo's skull fractured by a blunt object. My chest tightened. I don't remember anything," I whispered. "Memory suppresses trauma," she said calmly. "But truth finds its way back." The humming intensified. It was the song Leo used to sing while cooking, brushing his teeth, whenever he wanted to make me laugh. That night, I woke on the floor, arms wrapped around nothing, holding the ghost of him. Flashes came. Arguments, shattered glass, Leo storming out the door. I remembered chasing him, world spinning too fast. Words and fear collided in my mind, but then it cut out. Dr. Albright told me, "Memory won't ask permission, Marcus. It will arrive when you're ready." 2 nights later, I woke gripping a cold, heavy object, the antique bookend Leo used as a doorstop. Dropping it felt like burning my own hands, and then it all came rushing back. The fight, Leo's tears. "I can't do this anymore." My rage, the struggle, the snap of the bookend, his scream. The song wasn't in my head, it was Leo's voice, his last echo. I collapsed, gasping, drowning, in horror. Confession was easier than I imagined. I told Detective Reyes everything, every memory, every suppressed detail. I shook, but I spoke, because denying it was killing him again. In the holding cell that night, the humming returned. Not accusatory, just present, a reminder. That truth always surfaces. Dr. Albright visited before sentencing. "Memory hides what we can't face," she said softly. "Healing begins when we stop running." I nodded. I had been running all my life. Now, finally, I faced the consequences, the memories, the song that never left me. The truth cannot remain buried forever. Owning our mistakes, even the darkest, frees us from the chains of guilt and begins the path toward accountability and inner peace. I never expected to end up at Marwood Hill Sanatorium. Nestled in the Vermont hills, its snow-dusted spires and endless corridors seemed both eerie and comforting in a way I didn't understand. I was running from memories I couldn't bear, from myself, and from the echo of a single night that had shredded the fragile remnants of my sanity. They said isolation heals. I thought it might. I thought I could hide behind scrubs, behind the authority of a uniform, and finally find silence. But the first night taught me quickly that some silences are heavier than screams. The facility had an unsettling calm that clung to the walls. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine cleaner. The night shift nurses moved like ghosts themselves, speaking only when necessary, their eyes always alert. I tried to immerse myself in the routines, checking vitals, emptying charts, patrolling the halls, but nothing could distract me from the strange unease that settled in my chest. Then there was room 7B. I saw him the first night in a window reflection as I passed by the nurse's station. A man lay on the floor, prone, his eyelids crudely stitched shut. His body was restrained as if he could spring forward at any moment. I froze, my blood pounding. I blinked. When I looked again, nothing. But by the next night, he appeared in polished floors, in metal, trays in the supply room, in every reflective surface I passed. I mentioned it casually to another nurse. "Room 7B's been empty for years," she said, almost dismissively. That answer didn't help. He was there, and he was waiting. I started having trouble distinguishing the shadows from reality. In the mirror, I thought I could see him moving, twitching, waiting for me to notice. The more I tried to ignore him, the stronger his presence felt. I questioned my own mind. Was I seeing something that didn't exist, or was something in the hospital playing tricks on me? I couldn't tell anymore. And then came the suture kit, cold, sharp, and unmistakably real, tucked inside my coat pocket, though I had no memory of putting it there. That night, as I wandered the halls, I realized that something inside me was being triggered. I couldn't explain why I kept glancing at room 7B, why my body ached to go closer. I felt as though the walls themselves were whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. The weight of anticipation was suffocating, and I sensed that this was only the beginning of a confrontation I couldn't escape. I was already being drawn in. By the third night, I could no longer ignore the feeling that room 7B was alive, watching me, waiting for something I didn't understand. My steps grew cautious. The hospital corridors, normally quiet, now seemed hostile. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and shadows stretched across the walls like long fingers. Every reflective surface betrayed him. I saw him, lying there, stitched eyelids fixed, following me with impossible attention. I couldn't explain it. I confronted a colleague during a late break. "There's no one in room 7B, right?" I asked quietly. She gave me a steady, measured look. "No one. It's been empty for years. You should stop fixating on it, Shaw." Her tone was calm but dismissive, like I was imagining the entire thing. I left the break room, but the weight didn't lift. On my rounds, I found myself standing outside the room longer than usual, staring through the window at nothing. My hands trembled. Sleep was no refuge. My dreams rotted into waking visions. At times, I'd see him out of the corner of my eye, then blink, and he would vanish. Then the whispers began. A low, hoarse voice that seemed to come from nowhere but everywhere said, "He should have never seen you. Do it." My heart lurched every time. I questioned my sanity. Each night, I checked the cameras. They confirmed it. I was alone, standing outside room 7B, staring into emptiness, sometimes for 20 minutes at a stretch. My mind was betraying me. Then I found the suture kit in my coat again, cold and metallic. It was unnervingly familiar. I asked myself if I had placed it there, but my memory offered no answers. I felt like a stranger to myself. I began keeping logs of my observations, jotting down every reflection, every glimpse, every movement of shadows. I was terrified of what I might discover if I didn't. On one particularly still night, I almost screamed when I saw him in a reflection, not in the room. This time, not just in the window, he was moving slightly, though his eyes remained sewn shut. My pulse raced. I knew instinctively that I was standing on the edge of something irreversible, something I couldn't hide from, and that my own mind might be the greatest danger I had yet encountered. The following week, I spent hours going over patient logs and reports. During one late night session in the records room, I came across a sealed incident report. My name, smudged and nearly illegible, was written across the top corner. My hands shook violently as I opened it. Inside was a photograph, a man with swollen eyes, the same man who had haunted my reflections, labeled unmistakably as my victim. I dropped the folder on the floor, my knees weak. The memories hit like a hammer, sharp, undeniable, and horrifying. I remembered the night clearly now. The screaming, the needle, the desperate, uncontrollable shaking of my own hands. And the man. His eyes had seen too much. My mind had blocked the memory, sewn over it like the stitches I now saw on his eyes in every reflection. Panic surged. I felt exposed, naked in a world I had constructed around lies. The truth, cold and brutal, was closing in. The head physician eventually found me wandering near room 7B, talking to myself. His expression was calm but firm. "Genevieve," he said, "you're not a nurse. You never were. You're a patient here." My mind refused to accept it. I tried to speak, but words failed me. He continued, explaining that I had been admitted after attacking a stranger who had witnessed my breakdown. My mind had created a new identity to escape the memory. To survive the terror of what I had done, I staggered backward, feeling the floor shift beneath me. Every hallway, every door, every lock now seemed designed for me alone. Room 7B became a mirror of my fractured mind. The man was no longer just in reflections. He was everywhere. The uniform, the scrubs, the title, they were all lies. A mask I had worn to avoid facing the most terrifying reality, myself. I understood then that I had created the greatest monster imaginable, and I was both victim and perpetrator. As days passed, the distinction between reality and delusion blurred. I spoke to other patients and staff, but my words felt hollow, my actions mechanical. Each reflection, each shiny surface, reminded me of him, of the stitches, of what I had done. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, of every sound, every shadow. The hospital felt alive, responding to my fear. Every locked door, every steel handle, seemed like it belonged to me, guarding me from or against something I could not fully confront. One night, I caught sight of him moving slightly again. The stitched eyes never opened, but I could feel his attention on me. My pulse raced as I whispered to the empty corridor, "I'm here. I see you." No response, but the air felt heavier, oppressive. I realized that the hospital itself had become an extension of my mind. Each patient, each quiet nurse, each echoing step reminded me of the false life I had constructed. I had to confront it. I had to confront myself. The whispers, the visions, the reflections, all pointed to a single truth. The danger was never outside me. It had always been inside. I forced myself to sit in room 7B, staring into its emptiness, acknowledging the stitched figure in the mirror. My voice trembled. "I remember." And in that acknowledgement, something shifted, faint, fragile relief, like the first deep breath after holding it in too long. I finally understood the scope of my own mind, the lengths I had gone to protect myself from unbearable truth. The man in room 7B, the whispers, the suture kit, they were all mirrors of what I had tried to bury. Facing the reality, admitting what I had done, became the first step toward reclaiming even a fraction of myself. The sanatorium was never a prison, it was a reflection of my own psyche. A place where truth could no longer be avoided. Now, I wander the halls, not as a nurse, not entirely as a patient, but as someone learning to reconcile memory with reality. Every mirror, every polished floor, is a test of courage. The moral is clear. The monsters we fear are often not outside us. They are the choices we refuse to confront, the truths we try to hide, the selves we deny. Only when we face ourselves honestly can we hope to survive, not unscathed, but aware, awake, and finally unafraid. I never thought a single stretch of asphalt could feel like the end of the world. But Route 47 inches, Nevada proved me wrong. The fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing everything beyond the headlights, turning familiar markers into shadowy ghosts. My car coughed, wheezed, and finally gave up, leaving me stranded with nothing but the wind and the silence of the desert. I stepped out, hearing the tires crunch on gravel, my breath visible in the cold night air. My phone had no bars, none. I was utterly alone. I trudged along the highway, trying to stay calm, eyes straining for any sign of life. After what felt like hours, a neon glow appeared through the haze. A motor lodge, the kind you see in old movies, its sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. Relief washed over me. I pushed open the door to the lobby, the smell of mildew and cheap carpet greeting me like a friend. The manager, a thin man with hollow eyes, nodded but didn't offer more than a grunt. "Room 4, he said. The key felt heavy in my hand, as if it carried more than just entry to a room. That night, I tried to sleep, but the desert wind carried strange sounds. Dull thuds above me, soft cries, a woman's wail that clawed at my nerves. I called down to the manager. He shook his head. "There's no second floor. That's a crawl space, sealed years ago." Ignore the desert's pitas, tricks, he said. But ignoring something doesn't make it vanish. Every night, the noises returned, closer now, footsteps dragging across boards, a child sobbing, a heavy object rolling unseen. I told myself it was the wind, or rats, or my imagination. I was wrong. Sleep brought no peace. I dreamt of my brother's house, the shattered lamp, the blood smeared, across the floor, the baby's room at the end of a dark hallway. I woke sweating, unable to convince myself that I had merely imagined it. My own memory felt fractured. I wanted to reach out, to call someone, but every attempt ended with static, as though the desert itself had unplugged my life. I wandered the motel at night, trying to trace the source of the cries, but the building was empty, save for the humming of the vent and the occasional drip from the sink. The manager's words echoed, "Ignore the desert's tricks." Easy to say when you aren't lying awake, waiting for something unseen to come closer. I began noticing small inconsistencies. Room 4's wallpaper looked different depending on how I entered. Shadows that didn't match the furniture, floorboards that seemed longer or shorter. I started to doubt my own senses. Was this a trick of exhaustion, or something darker? The desert night seemed alive, watching. I told myself that when morning came, clarity would return, but every morning the fog lingered, and with it, the echo of a child's cry, a voice pleading that I couldn't place, a sound that made my chest tighten and stomach knot. My dreams and reality began to blur. The morning came abruptly, with a knock on the door that felt violent. 2 state troopers burst in, rifles lowered but faces stern. My instincts screamed to run, but I was too stunned to protest. Handcuffs clicked around my wrists, the cold metal biting into my skin, and I realized I had no idea what was happening. In the interrogation room, they spread photographs across the table. My brother's house, my brother and sister-in-law, lifeless, brutally murdered. The date on the corner matched the night I had been on Route 47. I opened my mouth, tried to explain, but all I could manage were fragments. I stayed in room 4, the wallpaper. My voice sounded foreign to me, trembling with desperation. The detective leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "These are manufactured memories," he said. "You aren't remembering reality. Your mind built a refuge." My head spun, my heart pounded. I wanted to scream, to reject it, but deep down, a flicker of recognition gnawed at me. The road, the fog, the lodge, was it ever real, or was it a carefully constructed illusion? The psychiatrist was patient, but unwavering. "Your mind protects you from what you cannot face," he explained. Slowly, piece by piece, fragments returned. The argument with my brother, the surge of jealousy, the uncontrollable rage. I remembered the moment clearly. The baby had seen everything. My hands trembled as the weight of it settled in. The sounds in the motor lodge, the dragging, the crying, the heavy rolling objects, were never above me. They were echoes of my niece's screams as I fled. Guilt and panic blending into something I had convinced myself was safety. The fog, the highway, the abandoned motel, they were my mind's attempt to hide me from myself, to shield me from the horror I had committed. Even now, confined in a padded cell, I replay the road endlessly. The neon sign, the cold wind, the haunting cries, they were all part of my illusion, a desperate, fragile cover for the truth I could not face. My reality was a patchwork of lies, a mirage built from memory and fear, until the moment my own mind forced me to confront it. I sit in silence now, stripped of freedom and illusions alike. The desert, the highway, the fog, none of it saved me. The mind is cunning, hiding truths until it decides that the only way to survive is to crush you with them. I feel the weight of every choice, every lapse in judgment, and the knowledge that no place in the world could have kept me from the consequences. If there is a moral to my story, it is simple. Running from the truth is a fragile defense. The mind may construct illusions to shield us, but the reality we try to escape has a way of finding us, relentless and unforgiving. The desert was never my refuge. It was never Route 47, the lodge, the fog. It was my own mind, crafting a highway to nowhere. until it collided with the one truth I could not outrun. I am responsible for what I've done, and no illusion can hide that forever. I never intended to be an innkeeper. The Wayfarer's Rest wasn't just a job, it became my sanctuary, my laboratory, my world. I first arrived in Maine during a spring storm, the kind that made the Atlantic crash against the cliffs as if it were trying to swallow the world whole. The widow who sold me the inn warned me it would break me in ways I couldn't imagine. She had a soft, tired smile, and in her eyes, I glimpsed the years of secrets the building had held. I didn't listen, of course. Solitude had always been my aim, and here, in this wind-swept place, I finally found it. The inn itself was ancient, with creaking floors, peeling wallpaper, and hallways that smelled faintly of salt and mildew. Yet, there was something comforting in its imperfection, a rhythm too, the way the wind bent the beams and the rain tapped the windows. My first nights were spent wandering the halls after the last guest had retired, marveling at the quiet. There's a strange intimacy in hosting strangers. You see them at their weakest, when life presses down and all pretenses fall away. That's when I began noticing Small Tell's hands trembling as tea was poured, eyes darting nervously, subtle foot taps betraying tension. I began keeping notes, at first in my head, then in a small leather-bound journal. I told myself I was cataloging human behavior, trying to understand the nuances of fear, exhaustion, and hope. But the deeper I observed, the more I craved the intensity of someone unraveling, not out of malice, but for understanding. The basement of the inn, narrow and windowless, became my private theater, a place where I could see how life stripped people down when their shields were gone. It was unsettling, even for me, how much power a simple observation could hold. Guests arrived and departed in waves. Some smiled politely, some murmured quietly, and some shivered with unspoken anxiety. I learned the art of small talk, of warm greetings, and subtle gestures that put people at ease while I watched closely. "Do you need anything extra for your room?" I'd ask, hiding my deeper purpose beneath a veneer of hospitality. And when the storm howled outside and the inn groaned under the weight of the wind, I would linger in the shadows, listening for the precise moment comfort gave way to unease. By the end of that first month, I understood the rhythm of my new life. Guests came with their worries, their secrets, their exhaustion, and I was there to witness it all, a quiet observer of human fragility. I never touched anyone, never intruded, but in the silence and solitude of the cliffside inn, I found a strange satisfaction in recording the subtle collapse of hope, the quiet tremors that revealed the truth behind polite faces. And in that quiet, I began to wonder whether my solitude had a price, one I had not yet realized. By the second month, I had developed a routine. Mornings were for maintenance, sweeping the floors and repairing the weather-beaten windows. Afternoons were for cataloging observations, noting the subtleties of human behavior that most people overlook. There was a rhythm to it, a dance between hospitality and study. The guests never suspected that beneath my polite demeanor, I was analyzing the tremor of their hands, the irregularity of their breathing, the fleeting moments of hesitation in conversation. One rainy evening, a young couple arrived, soaked to the bone. "You'll find the fire room cozy," I said, leading them up the main staircase. Their shoes left wet prints across the faded carpet, and they laughed nervously as they brushed damp hair from their faces. I noticed their fingers, brushing together, their shared attempt at comfort. That night, I wandered the hallways, listening to the storm and their quiet murmurs. Every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of wind through the eaves became part of my study. I made meticulous notes in my journal. Couple, mid-20 seconds, traveling from Boston, anxiety evident, subtle gestures indicate underlying tension, sleep disrupted by storm, interaction, mild relief, in presence of others, fear of isolation apparent. These weren't just words, they were a map of human vulnerability. I told myself repeatedly I was a scientist, documenting patterns, conducting long-term behavioral studies. But deep down, I knew I was fascinated by the moment when life's pretense fell away. When people revealed themselves fully, even unknowingly, guests sometimes mentioned faint tapping in the walls, the old beams, I would say, the gulls, maybe. Nobody questioned me. Polite smiles, nods, small talk, all of it concealed my true focus. And every night, when the storm raged outside, I would descend into the basement, walking between the narrow, windowless chambers I had built. I never harmed anyone, physically. Observation, patience, and quiet presence were enough to witness the human mind in its most unguarded state. I learned to predict behavior, to anticipate when fear would replace comfort, when exhaustion would tip into despair. Each guest became a study, a case file, and I documented everything. Some visitors would never return, their stories unfinished, others left with relief, unknowingly, leaving me a perfect record of their hidden struggles. I felt a quiet power in this, a strange mixture of curiosity and control. And yet, in the rare moments when I reflected, I wondered if my fascination came at a cost to them, to me, to something I could no longer name. The inn was no longer just a place to shelter travelers. It had become a theater, and I, both host and observer, had learned the delicate art of blending warmth and scrutiny. I was invisible in plain sight, and the stormy Maine coast kept my secrets well hidden. But I also felt the stirrings of conscience, the faint whisper that wondered if observation alone could ever justify intrusion into human vulnerability. The basement was the inn's true secret. To visitors, it was simply a storage space for old barrels and supplies, dusty and forgotten. To me, it was a series of narrow, windowless chambers where I could observe, uninterrupted, the effects of isolation, uncertainty, and the subtle pressures of fear. I never harmed anyone physically. My studies relied entirely on patience and the power of suggestion. The human mind, I discovered, could reveal more under quiet pressure than any experiment ever could. I spent hours designing each chamber for maximum observation. Shelving concealed them from view, and barrels created false walls. From above, the rooms looked ordinary, mundane, and welcoming. Yet within, life's tension unfolded with startling clarity. The first time I watched someone truly unravel, I felt an odd thrill. It wasn't cruelty, it was understanding. I documented everything, every tremor of the hand, every hesitation in speech, every flicker of fear in the eyes. Guests who noticed odd sounds in the basement, tapping, scraping, shifting shadows were quick to blame the building or the storm. The old beams are moving, I'd say, offering a polite smile. Nobody questioned me further. They left their fears in the shadows, and I recorded them. Every observation was catalogued, with careful detail, in my leather-bound journal. Over time, the entries became a map of human fragility, a record of what people hide from the world, and, sometimes from themselves. One night, a businessman arrived, anxious and exhausted from travel. He complained of a headache and muttered about deadlines. I offered tea, checked his room, and listened from the hall. The storm outside made the floorboards groan. In the basement, I watched as the tension in his shoulders unfolded, the subtle tremor in his hands as he sipped the tea, the way his eyes darted to shadows. By morning, he had relaxed slightly, unaware that every movement had been recorded. I told myself repeatedly that I was a scientist, that this was a study of human resilience and vulnerability. But the more I observed, the more I understood the power of subtle influence, the way a gentle suggestion, a slight hint of unease, could reveal layers of the mind that words alone could not reach. It was fascinating, terrifying, and intoxicating all at once. The inn was a stage, the guests actors, and I was both audience and director, quietly shaping what could be, revealed and concealed. I had grown used to the rhythms of the inn, the ebb and flow of guests, the quiet symphony of storms and waves. But one autumn night, a solitary traveler arrived, a man who seemed heavier than his luggage, burdened by more than the road could account for. He gave his name as Mr. Latham, and his eyes were haunted, darting to corners of the room even as he smiled, politely. I showed him to the smallest room at the end of the hall, near the kitchen. "It's cozy," I said, masking my observation with a warm grin. He nodded, muttering something about deadlines, debts, and sleep. I followed my usual routine, quietly observing from the shadows, listening to the subtle tremors in his voice, the tapping of his fingers against the desk, the way his eyes flickered to the window whenever the storm raged outside. There was no malice in my attention, only fascination. The way fear and exhaustion chipped away at composure, it was remarkable. Later that night, I descended to the basement, my boots echoing softly in the narrow halls. Mr. Latham had wandered down after hearing what he thought was a strange sound, a low thump, against the wall. I made sure he didn't see me, but from my hidden vantage point, I watched his tension build. His breathing quickened. He fumbled with the light switch, then cursed softly. There was no physical confrontation, only the exquisite unraveling of nerves. By morning, he had vanished. No note, no trace. The room looked untouched, as if he had simply walked into the Atlantic mist outside. Guests who arrived later speculated, maybe he left early, maybe he got lost in the storm. Nobody suspected the truth. I recorded every detail in my journal, noting the precision with which a person can disappear when observed. When, pressured by circumstance and subtle influence, the inn had claimed another story, and life outside continued without questions or scrutiny. The police arrived weeks later, investigating local disappearances. They asked about guests, about comings and goings. I smiled, hospitable, helpful, polite. I handed over ledgers, reservations, names, dates. Everything seemed ordinary. Inwardly, I catalogued the futility of their inquiry, marveling at how the world overlooked the quiet, unnoticed corners where life truly unfolded. Observation, patience, subtle influence, these were my tools. My work was meticulous, invisible, and, I thought, utterly justified. I realized, though, that the thrill of observation carried weight. Each disappearance, each unraveling, left traces in the mind. Mine, especially. I felt the stirrings of a conscience I had tried to ignore. Was it ethical to study human fragility in such isolation? Could I justify the intrusion, even if I caused no physical harm? Questions like this whispered in the stormy halls, mingling with the scent of rain and the faint echo of waves crashing against the cliffs. And yet, I returned to my routine, knowing that the inn demanded attention, that the curiosity within me could not easily be silenced. Months passed, and the inn stood quietly on the cliff, its secrets intact. Newspapers occasionally published stories of disappearances in Maine, of travelers vanishing along remote highways. I read them with calm detachment, noting the patterns, the human responses, shock, speculation, fear. Emotionally, I felt almost nothing, yet my journal expanded daily with precise entries, a catalog of human behavior and vulnerability. Still, a small, persistent voice inside me began to question my work. I started planning my next location, a highway rest stop far from towns, far from prying eyes. It would be an ideal place to observe without interference, to continue the study I had refined over years. The layout was already sketched in my mind, the optimal points for observation chosen, yet the whisper of conscience grew louder, reminding me that every life is sacred, that curiosity has limits. I could see patterns, predict behavior, analyze human fragility, but at what cost? One late night, I sat by the fireplace, journal in hand, reflecting. I realized that my obsession with observation had blinded me to empathy. I had learned everything about human vulnerability, but almost nothing about human connection, about trust, compassion, or the value of life beyond study. The moral was clear. Knowledge without care is a dangerous thing. One can see every tremor, every hesitation, every moment of despair, but without kindness, the observer becomes lost, disconnected from the very humanity they study. I closed my journal, feeling the weight of my choices. Hospitality, observation, study, these had defined me. But the lesson lingered. Curiosity must be tempered by empathy. Life cannot merely be catalogued. It must be honored. Each person has a story that deserves respect, even when their vulnerabilities are tempting to analyze. I had learned this too late, but perhaps awareness itself could guide my next path. The Wayfarer's Rest remained empty for a while, a quiet monument to my work and my failures. I smiled softly, thinking of future journeys, of human stories waiting to be told, and this time, I vowed to observe without losing sight of the value of life itself. Empathy would be my compass. Curiosity could illuminate, but it must never replace conscience. That, I realized, was the truest lesson the inn had taught me. I thought distance could heal me. That was my first mistake. I rented a small cabin by a quiet lake in northern Minnesota, somewhere far enough from everything to drown out the echoes of my past. The cabin was nothing remarkable, just weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. I told myself that silence, the hum of the lake, and the cold wind through the pines would calm the nightmares that had been visiting me since I'd stopped sleeping normally. I didn't tell anyone what those nightmares were. Not my friends, not my therapist. Even saying the words out loud made the skin on my arms crawl. The first night, I woke to the smell of kerosene. My throat tightened, and I almost convinced myself it was the wind carrying the faint, sweet smell of burning from some distant cabin. But then I noticed the crackle wood popping as if a fire were alive somewhere in the room. I shook my head and laughed quietly, a nervous sound that bounced off the cabin walls. Maybe it was the old plumbing. Maybe it was just me, exhausted, imagining things. The next morning, I found black soot on my fingertips, not the faint dust of a fireplace, but real, sticky residue. And lying on my pillow, a small box of matches. My chest tightened, and I felt a bead of sweat run down my back. I didn't want to admit what I thought, but the thought came. Anyway, I could be losing my mind. I set up a cheap camcorder in the living room, facing the bed. If I could just capture it, just see what was happening when I wasn't awake, maybe I could understand it or prove it wasn't me. The footage made me wish I hadn't bothered. In the middle of the night, I watched myself sleepwalk. My body moved with an eerie precision, stacking my clothes in neat piles, reaching for the matches with trembling hands, and holding them over the pile as if trying to ignite something I couldn't remember. I watched, frozen, as my own reflection betrayed me. I didn't know what to do, whether to call someone, or hide the truth even from myself. I noticed my phone, too. The last several calls were all to my therapist, though I had no memory of dialing her. I debated lying, pretending this was all harmless sleepwalking, until a voice inside me whispered that I couldn't lie to her, not this time. I called her, trembling. "Thomas," she said, calm and measured. "How have you been sleeping?" "Not well," I admitted. Something is happening. I wake up with soot on my hands. Matches. I don't know what's happening." She didn't interrupt. Instead, she waited, letting the words tumble from my lips like broken glass. Then she said softly, "Thomas, there's something you need to understand. You haven't been living in a cabin." I laughed. Weak, hollow laughter that sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Of course I have. I rented it. I drove up here. No, Thomas," she interrupted gently. "The cabin is a construct, a therapeutic simulation inside the facility. You've been here, in controlled treatment, since the incident." I stared at her, my mind racing and refusing to believe her words. "But the lake, the fireplace, everything." She placed photographs in front of me. My wife, my daughter, wrapped in blankets, charred, wood all around. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The truth was a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it impossible to breathe. I had done this, in a drunken rage. I had doused my own house in kerosene. My mind had constructed the cabin to protect itself from the horror of what I had done. The smell of fire, the crackle of wood, the soot, they weren't dreams. They were memories clawing back through the walls I'd built. Days passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The staff were gentle but firm, guiding to me through a reality I hadn't wanted to face. I saw the videos again, but this time through their eyes, as a therapist explained what had been happening while I slept. Sleepwalking, dissociation, memory suppression, all mechanisms my mind had employed to survive the unbearable. I cried for my family, for the moments I would never get back, for the warmth of their presence that I had destroyed in a single, impulsive act. I tried to talk to them in my mind, apologized over and over, though I knew apologies weren't enough. My life had become a series of shadows and flickering lights, each one reminding me that some mistakes couldn't be undone. The nights in the facility were quiet, but the memory of fire never left me. I felt it in my chest, a flame that wasn't physical but burned with guilt and memory. For the first time, I began to understand that confronting my past, no matter how painful, was the only way to live again. I attended therapy sessions, recounted every detail, no matter how unbearable. The process was slow, painful, and exhausting. But each day, the flame inside me shifted. It no longer consumed me, it illuminated the truth. By the time I was discharged for outpatient care, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The fire inside me had never died. It had waited for me to face reality, to accept responsibility. Only then could I start to rebuild myself, piece by fragile piece. The moral was simple, if harsh. You cannot outrun the truth, no matter how far or how cleverly you hide from it. Healing begins when you stop running from yourself, when you look at the flames you've started and choose to learn from them rather than be destroyed. When I first saw the townhouse in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, I thought it would be a fresh start, a place to breathe through the tight, icy grip grief had left around my chest. Losing my brother had left me hollow, a vessel of routine and muted colors, and I believed a quiet, century-old house at the edge of the sea could absorb the weight of my memory. The street was lined with tall, frost-tipped maples, and the salty breeze carried the faint smell of the harbor. The house itself was imposing, a brick structure weathered by decades of wind and rain, its windows like eyes watching me decide whether I belonged there. I thought I had planned it all. Boxes packed, the movers leaving at 9, a weekend to unpack, and then a return to the slow rhythm of life. The first night, though, it all went wrong. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as the wind rattled the eaves, when I heard a breath, soft, deliberate, coming from above. I sat up, heart hammering, and tried to convince myself it was the insulation, settling, old pipes contracting, the usual creaks of a house this age. But there was a pattern, a slow, controlled inhalation, exhalation, almost as if someone were holding themselves back, listening. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. I had done that before when grief felt like a weight. I'd tell myself everything I saw, everything I feared, wasn't real. By morning, I was second-guessing my sleep-deprived mind. I made coffee in the kitchen and tried to push away the dread. But then I noticed the frost, not on the windows or the cold, northern walls where it made sense, but forming in a perfect line across the attic door. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, and a chill traveled up my arm despite the heating being on, full blast. I tried to rationalize it, shaking my head. Houses this old have quirks. Old houses hold memories, yes, but they also hold drafts, moisture pockets. Still, the frost looked deliberate, like frozen fingerprints, and my chest tightened. That night, I began to notice the small disturbances, my scarf wrapped around a chair, kitchen, knives aligned neatly along the counter, a faint hum drifting through the vents. The lullaby was the worst part. It wasn't just a tune, it was his tune. The one my brother used to sing when he wanted me to keep a secret. I froze, standing in the kitchen, heart thudding. How could this place, a house I'd just rented, carry his voice? The wind outside didn't make that sound. I went to bed after that, doors locked, lights on, and the attic breathing continued. I told myself, tomorrow I'd call the landlord, or maybe a handyman. The rational mind still clung to logic. But, deep down, I knew logic had nothing to do with what was waiting upstairs. The next morning, I started digging into the town records, old deeds, newspaper clippings, anything that might explain the house's oddities. It had belonged to a man named Leonard Harrow, a recluse with an obsession for controlling his environment. His obituary mentioned experiments on sensory deprivation. His family had vanished quietly, whispers of abuse scattered through old letters archived in the library. The thought made my stomach twist, but it also gave me a perverse sense of direction. Maybe there was a pattern to what I was experiencing. Maybe someone else had walked these halls before me and left traces of their approach. Madness. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't stay still. The attic door called to me, or maybe it was just my curiosity, desperate for closure. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The frost was more intense now, spreading across the railing like veins of ice, and my breath fogged. In the cold air, I tried to touch the doorknob cold metal, not just the chill of the room, but something beneath it, alive. Behind the door, I found nothing at first, just the wooden floorboards and shadows, until I noticed the crawl space behind the wall panel. It was narrow, just wide enough to squeeze through, and I felt a tremor in my hands as I moved aside the paneling. Inside were crude restraints and a notebook. The notebook made my heart stop. My brother's name was scrawled across the pages, his handwriting jagged and small, as if someone had tried to remember him, record him, lock him in words. I sank to the floor, the notebook clutched to my chest. Memories came rushing back, unbidden, and raw: his laughter, his quiet insistence that I listen, the way he would vanish for hours and come back with new secrets. And now, evidence that he had lived here, in this frozen, lonely place, before he disappeared completely. I remembered the moments I had blocked out, pretending they didn't exist, pretending he was still with me somewhere else. The breathing above grew louder, more strained. I could feel it in my chest, in the way the house seemed to pulse with expectation. Someone or something was aware that I had remembered. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs refused. The frost crept up the stairs, forming tiny fingerprints that weren't mine. I realized then that this house wasn't just haunted by memories, it was haunted by truths I hadn't been willing to face. I called the police. I expected confusion, maybe disbelief. Officer Green arrived, a tall man with kind eyes and the kind of calm voice that suggested he'd seen plenty but judged little. I explained the attic, the notebook, the frost, my brother's absence from records. He listened, without interruption, then gently told me something I wasn't ready to hear. The house had been empty for 10 years, and there was no record of my brother ever being here. I hung up, shaking, and rushed to the mirror in the hallway. For a moment, I didn't recognize the reflection. It was me, but the eyes were hollow, lips pressed as if stitched shut, staring back in. Accusation. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The reflection shifted as the attic door creaked open on its own. The air grew colder, and I realized the person or presence I had been fearing was never a stranger. It was a fragment of my own mind, a compartmentalized truth I had buried, desperate to avoid grief I couldn't bear. I sank to the floor, tears freezing on my cheeks. The house was not haunted by a ghost, nor by a previous occupant. It was haunted by me, by memory, by the things I refused to face. The frost, the misplaced objects, the lullaby. They were manifestations of my denial, growing more intense as I neared recognition of the truth. My brother hadn't been here physically, but emotionally, spiritually, he had been imprisoned inside my grief, my avoidance. For hours, I sat, notebook open, tracing letters, speaking his name into the cold silence. The air around me seemed less oppressive, though the frost remained stubborn, a reminder of the chilling grip of buried truths. I realized that facing the pain, rather than fleeing from it, was the only way to reclaim my life. In the following weeks, I tried to reclaim the house as my own, though it no longer felt just like a building, it felt like a mirror of memory. I moved furniture, repainted walls, and slowly, methodically unpacked, but I also confronted the lingering shadows. I allowed myself to remember my brother fully, not just the sanitized memories, but the hard truths, the silences, the anger, the pain. Some nights, the attic breathed. Sometimes, the lullaby floated through the vents. But now, I didn't cower. I recognized it for what it was. Grief, personified, teaching me to listen to the parts of myself I had hidden away. I wrote in the notebook, adding my own words alongside the faded script, allowing my voice to coexist with his memory instead of erasing it. I began to understand the house not as a threat, but as a teacher. The frost would form on cold mornings, but the warmth of my acknowledgement melted it bit by bit. Shadows in corners became friends, quiet reminders of the necessity to face the uncomfortable, the unseen, and the long-suppressed truths. The town records, the history of Leonard Harrow, the echoes of sensory deprivation experiments, they all became cautionary tales, guiding me to honor memory without letting it consume me. By midwinter, the house felt lived in, warm, and full of presence. I realized that ghosts exist, but not in the way stories make them out to be. They exist in our minds, in our refusal to confront pain, in our tendency to hide away sorrow and loss. The final night came like a quiet epiphany. I stood in front of the attic door, frost etched across the wood, and I spoke aloud. I spoke my brother's name, the notebook open beside me. The air shifted, lighter somehow, less like a trap and more like a release. The frost melted slightly under my fingertips, leaving faint wet streaks as though the house itself was breathing with me. I understood then that closure isn't about forgetting, nor is it about proof or police reports. It's about acknowledging truth, facing grief, and allowing memory to coexist with life. My reflection in the mirror was finally mine, eyes clear, lips relaxed. I wasn't stitched in silence anymore. The attic didn't stop breathing entirely, but I no longer feared it. It had become part of the rhythm of my life, a reminder that grief is living, that memory is sacred, and that the truths we hide often seek us out not to punish, but to guide. I learned something important through all of it. Denial only prolongs pain. Acceptance, though uncomfortable, is the path to freedom. I had been haunted not by a ghost, but by my own refusal to see. Now, the house was a sanctuary, a place of both remembrance and healing. Grief and loss, if ignored or suppressed, can become haunting forces in our lives. Facing painful truths, embracing memory, and acknowledging hidden emotions is the only way to truly heal and reclaim your life. I never thought I'd come back here. Sonoma Valley had been a memory I tried to smother. A scar I told myself would fade with distance and time. 10 years had passed since the night. Everything went wrong. I was younger then, reckless, convinced that life owed me forgiveness. The vineyard, abandoned and wild, waited like a patient predator. Vines tangled into thorny barricades, farmhouse boards sagging as if under a weight of regret. I drove past the crumbling gate, the wind tugging at my coat, and the scent of rotting fruit and wet earth rose like a warning. I had told myself I needed solitude to forget, to wash the shame off my skin, but as soon as I stepped onto the soil, my boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, I felt it, the familiarity of the place like a bruise I could never hide. The farmhouse groaned under the weight of wind and age, its windows dark, its doors swollen with moisture. I opened one, hearing the hinges scream, and stepped inside. Dust motes floated, in a single shaft of light, catching on my eyelashes. It was quiet, too quiet. I wanted it to be quiet. I told myself that the noises I heard, the creaks, the scuff of what could have been a boot, on the porch were animals, raccoons, foxes, maybe a wandering deer. Yet, when I ventured outside at dusk, I noticed footprints in the soil, boot prints, my size, my stride. I cursed under my breath, shaking my head. I had been here for 5 hours, talking myself into comfort, and yet, there they were, undeniable, mocking, following the same path I had walked. Something inside me flinched, but I forced myself to ignore it, stepping deeper into the vines that clawed at my legs like the past itself. That night, the house felt alive, whispering beneath my skin. I tried to sleep, but the sound of deliberate, slow footsteps circling the farmhouse kept me awake. I told myself it was the wind, settling boards, shifting branches, scraping the side of the house. I closed my eyes, telling myself stories of a simpler past, and for a while, it worked. For a while, I almost believed I could pretend everything had been forgotten. I woke before dawn, heart hammering, drenched in sweat, the dream of blood and screaming. still clinging to me like cobwebs. I needed answers. I went down into the cellar, the air musty, heavy with mildew, and the faint sweetness of fermenting grapes long past their prime. There, hidden under years of dust, I found a rusted pruning shear. It was coated in something dark. My stomach turned. Beside it, a wine bottle rested on a shelf, its label bearing the initials of my cousin. I froze, my fingers trembling, hovering above the object like it was alive, like it was daring me to acknowledge what I had done. I started exploring the vineyard systematically, flashlight in hand. The barrels smelled of earth, mold, and wine. But something else lingered, a hint of iron, of rot. Then I heard it. Soft at first, like the murmur of wind through branches, and then, clearer, a voice. Whispering, accusing, slicing through my thoughts with sharp insistence. "You left him," it said. "You left him to die." My hands shook so badly I had to set the flashlight on a barrel to steady it. I spun around, thinking someone had entered, but the cellar was empty. I found old journals in the farmhouse library, dusty and brittle. They told of a vineyard that had bred, once belonged to a man notorious for making workers vanish if they displeased him. The locals, even after generations, refused to speak of him. His methods were cruel, calculated, surgical in their intimidation. Reading those lines, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The vineyard had a memory, a history of vengeance, and maybe, just maybe, it didn't forget easily. I should have left then, but curiosity and a strange, self-punishing urge rooted me to the floor. Dreams came next, nightmares painted in red and shadow. I saw blood dripping onto grapes, felt the weight of someone calling my name from beneath the soil. I woke screaming, heart hammering in the pitch-dark bedroom, the storm outside slamming rain against the roof like a warning. The footsteps returned, closer this time, climbing the stairs with deliberate patience. My phone's flashlight barely illuminated the room, but I saw them, muddy handprints on my bedroom door, forming slowly, impossibly, as though some invisible force traced them with intention. Panic rose in my chest. I searched the farmhouse, every corner, every room. Then I found it, a trapdoor, hidden beneath a frayed rug, the wood warped but familiar. My fingers hesitated over the latch, knowing without knowing that whatever lay beneath it was mine to confront. The chamber smelled of damp stone, decay, and something else I could not name. And then I saw, two at the walls, carved messages, frantic, scrawled in my handwriting. I should not have recognized them. I had no memory of being here, yet my own hand seemed guilty, accusing me from the past. The realization hit like a hammer. My cousin had never disappeared. I had killed him, a drunken fight, a flash of rage, and buried him beneath the vines I now walked over every day. My mind recoiled from the truth, trying to hide, trying to convince me it was someone else's guilt, someone else's crime. But the storm, the voices, the footprints, they would not lie. They were mine. They were me. Footsteps descended toward me in the dark chamber, echoing in a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I turned, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Only the sound. My sound, repeating in the hollow of the earth, bouncing back from the walls that had witnessed everything. And in that echo, I finally understood. The vineyard did not need to remember for others. It only needed to reflect. My guilt had taken shape, had become tangible, had followed me home. I fled the chamber, stumbling into the rain-soaked night, the wind tearing at my coat as if urging me to confess, to make peace, to acknowledge the part of myself I had long buried. The farmhouse loomed behind me, silent now, patient, waiting for me to face what I had done. I did not leave the vineyard that night. I stayed, taking the first steps toward atonement, toward owning the truth I had evaded for a decade. I called the authorities, confessed everything, the fight, the burial, the lies I had told myself. I stayed to watch the vines grow wild, to witness the consequences of my actions, and to hear the echoes of the past, not as curses, but as lessons. The vineyard, the storm, the cellar, they were mirrors, reflecting what I had done and what I could not undo. In the end, the moral became clear. The past will always return when ignored, and no amount of distance or denial can hide guilt. We cannot bury the mistakes we make, but we can confront them, learn from them, and strive to live with honesty. I stayed in Sonoma Valley long enough to plant new vines, to nurture life where death had once lingered, and slowly, the echoes softened. They never went away entirely, but neither did I. And perhaps that is the only redemption anyone can ever hope for, facing the truth, however unbearable, and choosing to grow beyond it. The past cannot be buried. Only acknowledged and faced can one find redemption and peace. The first thing grief stole from me was sleep. Not all at once, but in small slices that disappeared, night after night until I could no longer remember what rest felt like. Tromso doesn't make it easier. By late December, the sun is a rumor, barely rising above the horizon, leaving the city in a permanent twilight that presses against your chest. I had learned to live in that darkness, just me and Ela, my 2-year-old daughter, navigating life like we were balancing on a thin wire. Her mother's absence left more than an empty chair at the dinner table. It left a quiet in the place, apartment that seemed to watch me as closely as I watched Ela. I worked as a marine technician on the harbor now, maintaining dockside sensors and navigation systems. Machines are easier than people. When a sensor fails, you know why. When a person leaves you, the reasoning is murky and unbearable. My hours were long, my pay decent, but the nights were endless. On one particularly cold December evening, I realized we were running low on essentials: milk, bread, diapers. Isla tugged at my coat, her little red mittens grasping mine, eyes wide as the wind whipped through the harbor parking lot. The storm had been building all day. Local news warning of whiteouts, gusts strong enough to push a small car sideways, but life doesn't pause for warnings. We parked near the supermarket, the wind shaking the car as if trying to lift it off the ground. That's when I noticed him, a man standing near the carts, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed. He wasn't looking at anyone else. He was looking at us, at Isla. I froze for a moment, telling myself I was seeing shadows because I was tired. Isla giggled, oblivious, pointing at the snow swirling like a small blizzard. I lifted her from the car seat, pulling her close, feeling the unnatural tension prickling my spine. Something about him wasn't right, but I pushed the parent thought aside. Maybe it was the wind, maybe my imagination. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly. I set Isla in the cart and tried to focus. Milk, bread, diapers, and a few cans of soup. The aisles smelled faintly of bleach and frozen food. I moved, quickly, trying to ignore the unease curling in my chest. That's when I realized the sound, or rather, the absence of sound was wrong. No carts rolling behind us, no shuffle of shoes, just a soft whisper of fabric, brushing fabric. I turned. He was there, calm, watching. And when I looked again, he was closer, near the exit, standing in a way that felt practiced, purposeful. Before I could react, he lifted Isla in his arms as if she weighed nothing, his pace deliberate and slow, completely unhurried. My stomach dropped. Time fractured. I screamed, lunged, hit him. Ila's wail cut through the storm outside, and for a moment, the man's expression betrayed satisfaction, not fear. Then he stepped into the snow, disappearing into the Arctic blizzard as if he had never been there. I stood frozen, heart hammering, trying to reconcile what had just happened. Calm doesn't belong in chaos. Calm doesn't follow you home. And yet, it had. And I would soon realize that this was only the beginning. The police arrived quickly, but their presence did little to calm the trembling in my hands. Storm. Damage had disabled all exterior cameras, and inside footage was useless, angles missed, faces blurred. Witnesses described him not as desperate, but as calm, methodical, almost clinical. That word haunted me more than any threat. Methodical. A random attack, screams, and struggles. This man had been patient, calculating. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the blizzard had swallowed him and that my daughter was safe. Isla clung to me, confused and scared, her little body pressing against mine as if my heartbeat could shield her from what had just happened. That night, I checked the locks on every door and window 3 times, then again before bed. I couldn't sleep. Not really. Every sound, every creak of the building made me jump. Every shadow outside the window seemed to stretch and curl toward me. Days passed, but my fear didn't dissipate. One morning, as the weak Arctic light barely touched the streets, I noticed footprints in the snow near our building, too large to be mine, too precise to belong to children or stray animals. My chest tightened. I told myself it could be coincidence or someone else wandering, but instinct screamed otherwise. I started moving Isla's toys each night, just to know if they stayed where they belonged. On the 3rd night, her stuffed seal was found on the couch instead of her bed. Small things, subtle things, but they burned away my sense of safety. I avoided errands, except when absolutely necessary. Every trip to the grocery store became a study in paranoia. I memorized the entrances and exits, the aisle layouts, the number of shoppers in each section. I noticed that Isla became quieter, more cautious in public, sensing my tension. Her laughter was tentative. I hated that. I hated that he had stolen more than a few minutes of our lives. He had stolen normalcy. I started carrying my phone in my coat pocket at all times, flashlight app ready. I walked faster, made eye contact with strangers more cautiously, and never looked over my shoulder without a reason. Still, the footsteps continued outside our apartment, the faint impression of someone lingering just beyond reach. I slept with the door unlocked, knife under my pillow, a candle burning faintly in the kitchen, as if light alone could keep evil at bay. And all the while I realized the truth. This wasn't random. It never was. He had studied me, studied Isla, and he had waited, patiently, calmly, and he could return whenever he chose. Christmas approached, but the usual joy never came. I bought decorations and lights but left them in boxes. Even the sound of carolers outside felt alien, like music from another life. Isla still enjoyed small things, her toy blocks, the glowing lamp by the window, but I couldn't let myself relax. Every passing snowflake felt like a warning. One evening, I heard the faint crunch of boots on packed snow outside our window. I froze, holding Isla tightly. The sound paused, then it moved again. I whispered to her, "Stay close, baby. Don't look." She clutched my arm and pressed her cheek to mine, trusting instinctively that I would protect her. I didn't answer the door. I didn't peek through blinds. I simply waited, heart hammering, listening to the wind mask and reveal the intruder's presence. The weeks blurred. I started documenting every incident, every strange sound or object out of place. I even installed an interior camera, though the thought of footage only added to my anxiety. I saw the man's image in my mind constantly, calm, composed, satisfied with the control he had over our lives. I began noticing other details, how Isla's favorite blanket sometimes appeared slightly moved, how certain doors seemed rattled even when locked. Each small observation was a puzzle piece confirming what I feared. He hadn't left. One night, sitting with Isla asleep on my shoulder, I whispered to myself, "This isn't over. It never was." I realized that fear could be a tool, but if I let it consume me, it would destroy us both. I had to be vigilant, but I also had to live. I couldn't let him dictate every breath. By January, I had transformed our apartment into a fortress of sorts. Locks, reinforced, cameras installed, routines memorized. I taught Isla small survival rules, not frightening, but practical. Stay close, always tell me where you are, don't open doors for strangers. She was learning fast, absorbing the tension I tried not to show, mimicking my caution. I returned to work at the harbor, but I was different. Every interaction, every colleague, every shadow in the warehouse became a study in intent. I realized that survival wasn't about brute force, it was about awareness. I practiced mental exercises, imagining scenarios, planning, reactions. I kept a flashlight in my coat pocket, a knife in the car, and a charged phone at all times. Yet, despite precautions, the man's presence lingered. Small signs reminded me. Footprints. Outside the apartment, a shifted toy, a half-burned candle I hadn't touched. I began to accept that he was patient, that his methodical calm wasn't just terrifying, it was a message. He wanted me aware, alert, living in constant calculation. And somehow, the realization sharpened me. I was no longer just a grieving father. I was a protector. Another storm arrived, fiercer than the first. I walked to the supermarket with Isla. Alert, prepared. Every sound, every movement was cataloged in my mind. We returned safely, groceries in hand, but the feeling didn't leave. The danger wasn't gone. It had never been. Random. He was patient, watching, calculating. I looked at Isla as she played that evening, a faint smile on her face. I realized the lesson life had carved into me with brutal precision. Vigilance isn't paranoia, preparation isn't fear, and love is measured not in comfort, but in protection. The world doesn't announce threats, and safety is never guaranteed. But in awareness, in presence, and in the unyielding commitment to protect what you love, there is power. I cannot predict if he will ever return. I cannot erase the memory of his calm smile, but I can ensure that Isla grows, learns, and survives. That is my responsibility. That is my victory. And that, perhaps, is the only way to live in a world where darkness can approach silently, patient, and unafraid. Danger rarely announces itself. True protection comes not from fear, but from awareness, preparation, and the unyielding commitment to those you love. Vigilance is survival, and love is its armor. Grief doesn't arrive suddenly. It lingers in corners of your life, quiet and persistent, like a shadow, refusing to leave. For Elise and me, that shadow had been our constant companion since the accident a year ago. We lost everything that once anchored us. Our friends, our routines even. The city itself felt too loud, too intrusive. The decision to leave Toronto for Banff was sudden but instinctive. We needed silence, snow, isolation, something that could feel untouched by loss. The city had become a place that reminded us of everything we'd failed to save. We arrived on Christmas Eve, the snow already thick, the mountains towering like silent guardians. The cabin was as advertised, rustic, secluded, with a chimney that promised warmth, and a door that promised privacy. I remember the drive up the winding road, the pine trees, bending under the weight of fresh snow, the way the headlights reflected off the ice, making it seem as if the world outside the car was made of glass. Elise hummed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in months, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something like hope. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and pine, faintly sweet. We unpacked in silence, each of us, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. I stacked the firewood while Elise set the small Christmas tree in the corner, its lights flickering warmly against the cold, white world outside. It felt good, ordinary, almost normal. That normalcy, however, made the first sound later that night, all the more jarring. Near midnight, a knock echoed through the cabin. Slow, deliberate, measured enough to pierce the calm but not enough to suggest panic. I froze, listening. Elise whispered my name, and I shook my head. Another knock came, then a soft male voice, calm, articulate, unnervingly precise. It said our names. It described details of our lives, things that no stranger could possibly know. I checked the locks, the windows, every door. Nothing. We were alone. But the voice persisted. The snow muffled the world outside, yet the voice was clear, almost intimate. Fear settled in slowly, like a living thing between us. I tried reasoning it away, imagining pranksters, hunters, someone lost in the storm, but the voice wasn't desperate. It wasn't clumsy, it was intentional, patient. The knocks continued, then stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. Elise clutched my arm. Outside, shadows moved, subtle, unidentifiable, and I realized we were no longer just visitors to this cabin. We were subjects in someone else's experiment. The next morning, I stepped outside into the crystalline snow, hoping to find footprints, evidence that someone had been there. Snow crunched beneath my boots, and the cold air burned my lungs. Yet there were no tracks, nothing beyond our own tire impressions and the faint outlines of the cabin's previous footprint. Yet, subtle things unsettled me. A package shifted slightly on the porch. A discarded coffee cup, left by the previous owner, had moved a few inches. Nothing overt, nothing violent, but deliberate. Someone was testing us, observing, leaving clues that could be noticed only if we were paying attention. Elise was tense but composed. She suggested we focus on the cabin, keep the locks checked, avoid confronting whatever or whoever was out there. I didn't trust that approach. My nights became sleepless, haunted by every creak of the cabin, every flutter of snow against the windows. The shadows in the trees seemed to move with intention, though when I squinted, there was never more than snow and dark shapes. Yet the unease was undeniable, tactile, the kind that seeps into your chest and refuses to leave. By evening, the knocks returned, slower this time. There was no voice, just rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, uneven, like someone playing with nerves. Elise held my hand, whispering that it would pass, that it might just be the wind. But the wind doesn't tap on windows in patterns that mock your heartbeat. And then I saw it, a shadow, fleeting, slipping between the trees, not moving like an animal, but calculated, measured. I raised the old hunting rifle we had brought, shouting that we were armed, that we knew someone was there. The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence, heavy and expectant. When the police were called reluctantly, because we were isolated, they found nothing. No footprints beyond the tree line, no sign of forced entry, nothing that suggested someone had been near us. They smiled politely, nodded, left, and yet the unease remained. Items outside. The cabin shifted slightly each night. Packages moved. Snow disturbed where no one could have walked. Someone had not failed. They had left a message in the smallest, most terrifying details. We were being watched, studied. Elise began to lose sleep. She would awake to tiny movements, small changes, subtle indicators that we were not alone. And I felt a growing terror, not from someone entering the cabin, but from the invisible hand that left its traces, a hand that might never reveal itself. Days passed with the snow thickening, roads impassable, phone lines unreliable. Our isolation became both sanctuary and prison. The first night had been an anomaly, I thought, until patterns emerged. Packages outside shifted again, carefully. Snow brushed aside, subtle depressions, appearing where no one could have stepped. I began setting small, crude markers in the snow, a twig here, a rock there, to see if they moved. They always did. Elise became quieter, more alert. Every creak of the cabin, every distant howl of wind, she interpreted as evidence. I began pacing, checking every lock, every window, every inch of our perimeter. Sleep became impossible. We ate little, drank less, both of us consumed by the tension. The psychological torment was more exhausting than physical danger could ever be. Whoever was doing this wasn't seeking confrontation, they were seeking control, study, manipulation. One evening, I decided to record the events. Cameras, microphones, anything to capture proof. The next night, the tapping began again, this time in response to the camera placements. It was like a game, a test. I shouted, threatened, begged the intruder to leave. Silence answered, except for a faint shuffle in the snow outside, vanishing before I could see it. Elise suggested we leave, but the storm had blocked the roads. We were trapped, confined in a psychological maze, prey to an unseen observer. The forest, once a haven, now felt like a cage. My mind started turning over scenarios endlessly, trying to predict the intruder's next move, feeling helpless each time the evidence proved me wrong. I realized, with a shiver, that our real danger wasn't someone breaking in. It was the uncertainty itself, the not knowing. On Christmas Eve, a week later, the tension became unbearable. I had armed myself with the rifle, pacing the cabin like a soldier. Elise tried to calm me, but I could see the fear mirrored in her eyes. Then it began. The slow, deliberate knocking, followed by a voice whispering our names. This time, it spoke of things no one should know, our conversations, our routines, even our fears. The voice was calm, almost casual, as if mocking us. I shouted, "Stay back, we're armed." My voice cracked, revealing the fear I was trying to suppress. The voice continued, describing my childhood, Elise's favorite memory of our wedding, details from letters we had thrown away weeks before. I realized that our anonymity had been breached long before we arrived. This was not random. This was preparation, stalking, a careful study of our lives. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence fell like a curtain. I opened the door, cautiously, snow untouched, footprints leading nowhere. The shadows were gone. The intruder had vanished without confrontation, leaving us both shaken and furious. We realized that the cabin had been more than a refuge. It had been a stage for someone else's psychological experiment. Weeks passed, roads cleared. The police remained baffled. No one ever returned, yet our lives were forever altered. Elise refused to go outside alone. Every sound, every movement beyond the cabin made her heart race. I installed security cameras, but they never captured anyone. The intruder had done their work, left us with the residue of terror, a lesson in vulnerability. I never imagined that Christmas Eve would turn into a night that would haunt me for years. The kind of night that leaves its fingerprints on your memory. The city of Brighton was alive with the usual festive chaos. Twinkling lights reflected off wet pavements, carolers' muffled voices drifting through foggy streets, and the smell of mulled wine in the air. I was sitting across from Marcus, Hale at a small, dimly lit bar near the pier, nursing a pint that had long gone warm. He was my boyfriend for nearly 6 months, charming in that quiet, unsettling way that made people forget to question him. But tonight, there was something off, not the usual playful teasing or the flirtatious smirk, but a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. We laughed at jokes neither of us really remembered later. He made casual remarks about how easily people vanish, how the world rarely notices. At first, I thought he was trying to be darkly funny, the kind of edgy humor that you sometimes tolerate to seem sophisticated. Then he started recalling details from conversations I had weeks ago with friends, things I hadn't even told him. At first, I laughed it off nervously, attributing it to Marcus being attentive, too attentive, perhaps. But the jokes had a precision to them, as if someone had dissected my life like a puzzle and placed the pieces perfectly. I remember the warmth of the bar contrasting sharply with the chill I felt crawling up my spine. When Marcus suggested a walk along the pier, I hesitated, the unease settling into the pit of my stomach. His hand brushed mine, and the gesture, which should have been comforting, felt like a tether. Every laugh, every casual remark now seemed layered with an intention I couldn't yet define. Brighton at night has a kind of deceptive beauty. The crashing waves below the pier, echoing, the street lamps painting gold halos in the fog, but tonight, it felt like the city itself was watching me, aware of the tension that Marcus exuded. I brushed off the thoughts, blaming them on the wine, on the darkness, on my own imagination. But there was no mistaking the control in his gaze, subtle, almost invisible, but present. Something in me told me to leave, to run, but part of me stayed, tethered to the person I thought I knew. I had no idea that within hours, I would be facing the full extent of his obsession, trapped in a chilling intimacy that blurred love and fear. As we walked through the quiet streets, Marcus spoke in the calm, deliberate way that had always unnerved me without explanation. He made casual references to my routines, to the people I met during the week, to conversations I'd had on phone calls I thought were private. The details were accurate, mundane, but precise in a way that made my stomach knot. I laughed uneasily, suggesting he must have a photographic memory. He smiled, but it was a tight, knowing smile, the kind that doesn't match the warmth in his eyes. Back at his flat, the air seemed heavier. Christmas decorations twinkled faintly, casting fractured shadows across the walls. He poured us another drink, and I found myself hesitating before taking it. There were subtle remarks, jokes about trust and loyalty, about how people sometimes vanish without warning, and about how easy it was to slip through the cracks. He was still calm, composed, but every word dripped with implication. I felt cornered in a way that wasn't physical, but mental, like the room itself was shrinking around me. Then he began repeating snippets of conversations I'd had with friends, not word for word, but enough to make me realize he had been listening, recording, even the intimate corners of my life. The panic started quietly, like a flicker of flame in the back of my mind, but it grew quickly. I tried to deflect, to laugh, to make it a game, but he didn't play along. His eyes watched me like a hawk, calculating every reaction. A part of me wanted to believe this was still a twisted joke, a test of intimacy or commitment, but another, louder part screamed that this was something darker. I wanted to leave, to say I needed fresh air, but every time I reached for my coat or my bag, Marcus's presence made me hesitate. He blocked the path subtly, casually, with a smile that was all charm and none of kindness. By the time I realized the night was no longer about celebration, but control, it was too late. The bar, the streets, the city, all of it had faded. There was only him, and the precision with which he manipulated every second. It was only when he calmly told me that the night was a test of loyalty, that the full scope of his intention hit me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't losing control. He was exercising it. The knife appeared next, not waving, not slashing, but steady, deliberate, a silent threat that left no room for argument. My hands shook, my heart raced, and yet I felt the sharp clarity of fear, the kind that forces you to focus on every detail. Marcus spoke as though reciting a script, only he knew, drawing from my private conversations, my habits, my fears. Every sentence, every pause, was calculated to manipulate, to assess. I realized then that he had been watching me, studying me, shaping this evening with a precision that was terrifying. The thought that my life had been under this surveillance for months left a hollow pit in my chest. I had known him as someone sweet, funny, charming, but I had been blind to the pattern beneath the mask. I understood quickly that escaping wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about timing, precision, and exploiting the briefest moment of overconfidence. My mind raced, remembering self-defense techniques I had never thought I'd use in real life, calculating angles and distances. I waited, heart hammering, as Marcus adjusted his stance, convinced of his dominance. When the moment came, I grabbed his wrist, twisted, and forced the knife from him, letting it clatter to the floor. His shock was brief, a flicker of surprise, and I didn't give him time to recover. I bolted toward the door, fumbling with the lock, every second an eternity. The city outside felt impossibly bright, the cold air shocking my lungs, a sharp contrast to the stifling tension inside. I didn't look back until I was blocks away, shaking, gasping, and aware that the danger hadn't ended, it had simply been paused. The days that followed were surreal. The police came, took statements, and confirmed what I had feared. Marcus was connected to multiple unresolved disappearances, mostly women who had been in emotionally controlling relationships. The realization that I hadn't survived by chance but because Marcus chose to let me go was chilling. Every laugh, every casual remark, every shared drink that night replayed in my mind with new weight. I couldn't sleep, couldn't trust anyone the same way again. The festive joy that once defined Christmas now carried an undertone of caution. Even ordinary interactions felt heavy, laden with the knowledge that people could mask obsession under charm, affection under control. I became hyper-aware of subtleties, the tone of voice, a glance too long, a question that seemed ordinary but was probing. I sought therapy, confided in friends, and slowly rebuilt a sense of security. But the memory of Marcus, the calm precision, the knife, the test, never left me. Brighton streets, once a comfort, became a reminder of vulnerability, of how thin the line can be between love, danger. I learned that trust is precious, but vigilance is necessary, and that instincts, however uncomfortable, should never be ignored. Months later, I would reflect on that Christmas Eve with a strange mix of gratitude and terror. I had survived not because I was lucky, but because I acted, and because Marcus underestimated the very thing he thought he controlled. The moral was clear. Manipulation can be subtle. Obsession can hide behind charm, and the people closest to us can hold the most danger. I learned to listen to intuition, to respect my own boundaries, and to never dismiss unease as paranoia. Love and control are not interchangeable. The world is full of darkness disguised as familiarity, and survival sometimes depends on recognizing that before it's too late. Now, years later, the lesson remains. Vigilance is not fear, it's self-respect. And, sometimes, walking away is the bravest act of all. I had never imagined that moving to Bruges would feel like stepping into a painting. Cobblestone streets glistened under the late autumn drizzle, medieval houses leaning precariously over narrow canals, their reflections quivering in the water. I was 24, freshly graduated, and broke, yet determined to carve a life for myself in this city of winding alleys and misty mornings. That's how I ended up in the attic room above Margot de Vries' house, tucked away at the end of a street few tourists noticed. The first time I met Margot, I was struck by her presence. She had a pale, angular face, framed by sharp black hair and eyes that darted like bats in a cave. "I'm particular about shadows," she said without preamble, leading me up the narrow staircase. "You'll see. Shadows are more alive than most people realize. You must be vigilant." I laughed nervously, thinking it a quirky eccentricity, the kind I'd encountered before in landlords who collected odd trinkets or cataloged books obsessively. The attic was small but affordable, the kind of place a young woman could live in without worrying about the bank. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the single window looked out over the canal, where mist hovered like a hesitant curtain. That night, I unpacked, quietly, humming to myself, unaware that the shadows cast by my belongings seemed a touch slower than reality, as if they were studying me. At first I dismissed the cold drafts slipping along my spine, as the house settling, or the wind, finding its way through cracks. But then, my shadow moved slightly out of sync. When I stretched my hand, it lingered a second too long. When I turned abruptly, it hesitated. My first instinct was fear, but I told myself I was tired and imagining things. Yet, as I lay in bed that night, staring at the irregular shape on the wall, I felt a chill crawl across the room, a chill that didn't come from the wind. By the end of my first week, The unusual became undeniable. Margot would pass my door, her eyes narrowing. "Careful," she murmured one evening, almost to herself. "It's learning too fast." Learning what? I didn't ask, too polite or too scared to press. And yet, as I drifted to sleep, beneath the sloping roof, I sensed that the shadows in the room were watching me in ways that defied logic. Something was waiting, something patient. Life in Bruges became a rhythm, but it was a rhythm colored by unease. I worked part-time at a cafe, serving coffee and pastries to locals who barely noticed my presence. I returned home, each evening to the attic, the shadows stretching across the slanted walls, waiting. At first, I told myself it was imagination, but small things began to accumulate. Items slightly moved from their places, the subtle sound of footsteps where there should be none, and the sense that the darkness in the corners was denser than mere shadow. I started keeping a journal, chronicling these oddities, hoping logic could make sense of them. One evening, as I was writing, I noticed my shadow detach entirely from my body as I leaned over the desk. It didn't mimic me, it lingered behind, watching. My pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. I froze, eyes wide, but when I looked again, it had returned, aligned perfectly as though nothing had happened. I tried to speak to Margot about it casually. "Do you really believe shadows are alive?" I asked over dinner one night. She didn't blink. "Alive is a weak word," she said. "They're aware. They learn, adapt. Most people don't notice until it's too late." She sipped her tea as if discussing the weather, and I swallowed my fear. I wanted to leave, but the rent was cheap, and my pride kept me rooted. The deeper the nights got, the more I noticed subtle, almost imperceptible movements in the completing corners of the room. Curtains fluttered though the window was shut. A chair's shadow sometimes stretched beyond its legs. One morning, I woke to find that my books were stacked in a pattern I didn't remember arranging. And there was Margot, standing silently in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "It's learning," she said, faster than I anticipated. A sense of inevitability grew. I couldn't explain it, and logic seemed powerless. I was not sure if I was in danger, or if the danger was something else entirely. I went to sleep one night praying for exhaustion to dull my senses, but the shadows kept their vigil, and somewhere deep in that silence, I began to feel that the house itself was alive, older and more patient than I could comprehend. The night it happened, I remember feeling an urge to rationalize, to assert control. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and tried to convince myself that a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion was at play. But the air in the attic was too cold, too heavy, and the shadows moved with a rhythm that made my heart skip. I first noticed it when the candle on my desk flickered without reason. Then, the shadow of my chair slid along the floor, stretching impossibly long. I stood, paralyzed, staring. My own shadow began to move independently, sliding toward the window, toward the darkness beyond the glass. I reached for it, shouting, and it jerked back, taunting me, refusing to comply. Margot appeared in the doorway, her eyes calm but penetrating. "Do not interfere," she said. "Some things must learn without interruption." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The shadows swirled around me, curling, stretching, forming shapes that were almost human. I realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't just shadows, they were guardians, watchers, ancient in some way I couldn't understand. And I was intruding. I ran. I didn't care where. I flung open the attic door, raced down the stairs, and didn't stop until I was on the street, gasping, drenched in sweat. Margot did not follow. The house loomed behind me, silent and immovable, the windows reflecting the dim light like eyes. I kept running, until the cobblestones and canals faded into nothing. That night, I slept in a hotel, convinced I had glimpsed something that defied reality, something that would haunt me forever. In the safety of daylight, I tried to make sense of what happened. I researched the history of the house, digging into archives and old property records. Margot's family had lived there for centuries, known locally as eccentric but respected keepers of traditions. I discovered whispers of a hidden chamber, an old family relic buried within the house, said to be protected by shadows, a living defense for something ancient and powerful. I began to understand. Margot was not malevolent. She was a guardian. The shadows were not malevolent either. They were her protectors, and by living in the attic, I had trespassed. Unknowingly, the knowledge chilled me. I had glimpsed a world beyond my understanding, one that required vigilance and reverence. Yet, there was fear intertwined with respect. That night, I understood that my shadow had been learning, adapting to my presence. Had I lingered too long, I might have become part of something I could not control. It was an ancient ecosystem of light and dark, and I was an intruder, unprepared for the rules it demanded. I left Bruges a week later, taking only my essentials and my memories, haunted by glimpses of that house and the knowledge that some things exist just beyond perception. Waiting, learning, I settled abroad, far from Bruges, in a place where the streets were wide and shadows harmless. Yet even years later, darkness unsettles me. I avoid abandoned buildings, dimly lit, attics, and quiet corners. Sometimes, when I glance at my own shadow, I feel a strange hesitation, a subtle pause, as if it remembers what I once ignored. The memory of Margot and her shadows stayed with me. She had protected something precious, something beyond ordinary comprehension, and I had learned a lesson that I carry to this day. Curiosity unchecked can bring you too close to forces that are beyond understanding. It was not only fear that stayed with me, but respect for the unseen, for history, for mysteries that demand careful observation and humility. I learned that not all shadows are passive. Some have purpose, memory, and intelligence. And sometimes, the things that watch are older, wiser, and far more patient than we will ever be. I remember the first day I stepped into that apartment like it was carved into my memory, every creak of the floorboards, every draft sneaking under the windows. Utrecht in late autumn had a gray patience, a slow drizzle that made the cobblestones shine like wet metal. I had moved there for work, for a change, a new rhythm after leaving a life that had grown too predictable. My new apartment wasn't much, a shared space with Victor Ruse, a quiet man with pale eyes and a fascination with things most people didn't notice. I had met him briefly during the viewing. He smiled politely, spoke softly about the apartment, rules, and handed me a folder of house logistics. He had a tendency to pause, just enough to make you feel observed, but never in a threatening way. I thought it was odd, maybe even charming in its own peculiar sense. That first evening, I carried boxes up the narrow stairs while the city's wind howled outside. Victor offered to help without asking, carrying the smallest boxes, with an awkward care, aligning them precisely along the walls. "It's better if everything has a place," he said. I didn't notice at first that he started to learn my routine. He would leave the kitchen, exactly. When I started making coffee, he would brush his teeth after I did, leaving the bathroom spotless, in a way that suggested he had observed, memorized, and timed me. I laughed it off as neatness, but there was something about the rhythm, the precision that made my skin crawl in. Subtle waves. It wasn't fear yet. Not yet. It was curiosity, the kind that sits quietly at the back of your mind, whispering that maybe you shouldn't be alone in your thoughts. By the end of the week, I realized he had cataloged my habits down to the minutiae when I read where I left my keys, even the way I hummed while washing dishes. Victor claimed it was an archivist's fascination, a desire to capture ordinary sounds before they were lost to memory. I believed him at first. Who doesn't want their quirks remembered? but the air felt heavier when I returned from work, a weight of observation that couldn't be ignored. Late at night, I would hear faint clicks, almost imperceptible, like a camera shutter in the dark. I told myself it was the old building settling. I told myself 100 things, but sleep became a fragile idea, a concept I had to chase through the night while my apartment kept its quiet watch over me. Victor's fascination, I decided, was harmless, or so I hoped. It started with the noises. Little things at first, a tap of a spoon, a shuffle across the living room, a whisper of my own voice. I convinced myself I was imagining it until I realized the sounds were too precise, too familiar. One night, I heard my laughter from earlier in the day playing back from somewhere in the apartment. I froze, glass halfway to my lips, heart hammering. "Victor?" I called, trying to sound casual. Nothing. Only the faint echo of my own voice. I moved through the apartment, turning lights on and off, opening cupboards, listening. There was nothing except the sound. I confronted him the next morning over coffee, my hands trembling around the mug. I think I heard myself last night. On a recording, maybe? He smiled, calm and almost delighted. Yes. I record sounds. Ordinary ones. They're truer than memory. It's how we preserve reality. And your reality, or mine? I asked sharply. Yours, he said, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. I just want to remember you before you change. I laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the unease curling in my chest. Before I change? Yes, people forget themselves. I like to hold on to things as they are, perfectly, honestly. Tapes, recordings, they don't lie. I didn't sleep well after that conversation. The sounds grew. My humming while making tea. My footsteps across the hallway, the quietest whisper of a sigh. They were stitched together, rearranged, playing back in the night with a clarity that made my apartment feel like a museum and me, the exhibit. By the end of the week, I found labeled tapes. Morning routine, evening thoughts, laughter, sadness, each one cataloging my habits, my moods, my voice. My panic rose, but I knew confrontation would be dangerous. Victor was calm, rational, and that was the worst part. He wasn't cruel. He was meticulous. I spent a week observing, pretending not to notice, keeping a journal outside the apartment. Victor never slipped. He never made a mistake. Every day, the recordings grew. He spoke less, listened more, watched silently from the other room as I moved through my routines. I realized he wasn't trying to harm me. He wasn't even trying to control me. He was trying to preserve me, to replace my presence with the recordings themselves. I found the main storage, hidden behind a false panel in his bedroom. Hundreds of cassettes and small digital drives, each labeled meticulously with dates and times, the smallest details. Recorded when I laughed at a joke, the way I sighed after reading an email, even my soft groans while stretching. I could feel the air in the room grow colder, heavier. Victor walked in behind me, calm as ever. "I see you found my collection," he said almost conversationally. "I thought you might be curious." "Why me? Why all this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To capture you," he said simply. "The way you are now, before the world changes you. I don't want to hurt you. I just need to remember." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense, but he was dangerous in a way that was more suffocating. He wanted to freeze me in time, to replace reality with his idealized version of it. I realized that resistance would only escalate his obsession. I started planning my departure, quietly, carefully, each step calculated. Victor would never see it coming. Not with his precision, not with his watchful calm. The night I left, I packed only what I needed: documents, a few clothes, my journal. I moved, silently, checking each room, confirming the usual patterns. Victor was asleep in his chair. The soft click of his recorder a lullaby in the background. I tiptoed out, closing the door behind me, leaving the apartment exactly as I had entered it months before. The streets of Utrecht were empty, shrouded in mist and drizzle. I didn't look back. I walked until the hum of my own steps replaced the sounds he had recorded. But even months later, the memory stayed. The faint mechanical clicks, the whisper of my own voice, in the wrong context they triggered panic. It was subtle, a flash of dread in the corner of the mind, but it reminded me that some predators don't chase. Some simply archive. And the worst part is, knowing they can't ever be fully escaped. Even years later, I hesitate when I hear a recorder, a click, a faint whisper. My apartment, my routines, my voice, they linger somewhere else, frozen in time, and I can't retrieve them. Looking back, I realize how fragile our sense of privacy really is. Victor's obsession was precise, almost clinical, yet he was fueled by something familiar: loneliness, admiration, fear of impermanence. He didn't intend to hurt me physically. He intended to capture me, preserve me, and replace my presence with recordings that could never age, never falter. I learned that not all threats are violent. Some are silent, methodical, and disturbingly intimate. The lesson is terrifying but necessary. Vigilance isn't just about protecting your body. It's about protecting your mind, your patterns, your essence. Some people won't chase you, they'll watch, wait, and record every step until the line between reality and memory blurs. Freedom, I realized, sometimes comes in small acts of courage, leaving without confrontation, reclaiming space, reclaiming the right to be imperfect and unrecorded. Privacy is sacred, and the moments we fail to guard, someone else might archive, stitch by stitch, until we are left with nothing but echoes of ourselves. I never liked driving at night, but Christmas Eve in Saxony meant long stretches of empty roads, frost-laden fields, and the occasional glow of a farmhouse fireplace far off in the distance. Stefan, my cousin, insisted on coming along, joking that I needed company because you get too moody behind the wheel, Lucas. I let him ride shotgun, mostly for the conversation though. I knew he'd rattle me more than calm me. We were coming back from a distant relative's celebration, the car packed with leftover marzipan, wine, and the lingering warmth of family. Laughter. The road ahead was deserted, save for the occasional barn silhouetted against the snowy landscape. The silence outside the car felt almost tangible, pressing against the windows. Stefan kept humming old Christmas carols quietly, as if to chase away the stillness, while I focused on the dim beam of headlights carving through the fog. That's when I saw her. A woman stood beside a stalled car, only the outline visible in the faint light, her arm raised. Slowly. Not frantically, but deliberately, like a practiced motion. My gut told me something was off. I slowed instinctively, but Stefan leaned forward, squinting. "Do you think she needs help?" he asked, voice low. Before I could respond, a dark SUV appeared behind us, the engine purring with an almost predatory precision. It matched our speed perfectly. No hesitation, no distance lost. The woman lowered her arm, her gaze locking onto the road ahead, expression neutral. She didn't need help. She was bait. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The SUV flashed its headlights in coded intervals, an odd rhythm that seemed deliberate, almost conversational. Pull over. The lights seemed to say, obey or face consequences. I gripped the wheel tighter, ignoring the instinct to confront, to stop and show courage. "Stefan, don't move," I said quietly. His nervous laugh sounded hollow in the enclosed space of the car. We passed the woman without incident, but the SUV didn't let up. Its presence was oppressive, deliberate. I didn't need to wonder about the intent. I knew enough from years of growing up, hearing local stories about hunters of people. Men who orchestrated fear for their amusement. Whoever was behind this wasn't desperate, wasn't careless. They were testing us. I pushed the car harder, aiming for the police station several miles ahead. The SUV stayed on. Our tail. Relentless. The closer we got, the more I realized this wasn't about catching us, it was about control. About watching reactions. By the time we reached the station, the SUV had vanished. No skid marks, no sign of a car ever. Being there, nothing but our shared unease, and the sound of our own breathing echoing off the cold walls of the empty parking lot. That night, I understood something crucial. Danger wasn't always obvious. Sometimes, it was curiosity in a predator's eyes, testing, observing, and, sometimes, surviving meant not giving them what they wanted. The officers inside the station were polite but skeptical. A dark SUV, flashing lights, a woman, staged by the roadside. One of them, a young man with a soft Saxon accent, took notes, diligently, his pen scratching against the paper. I tried to explain the precision, the feeling of being hunted, but even as I spoke, doubt crept into my own mind. Did we really see this? Could exhaustion or holiday spirits have played tricks? Stefan was pale, refusing coffee, staring out the frosted window. Lucas, I know it was real. You saw it too. I nodded but didn't speak. I'd learned to trust my instincts, the ones honed by years of observing subtle threats, reading intentions behind eyes. This encounter had all the hallmarks of something calculated. The police checked the area the next morning. No SUV, no stalled car, no footprints. Nothing but circular tire marks repeating endlessly along the road, like the predator had driven back and forth, watching, making note of reactions. My stomach turned as I considered the implications. Whoever did this wasn't targeting us specifically, they were testing responses. Patience, fear, obedience. Stefan tried to joke later, saying we were part of some secret game, but I didn't laugh. I kept replaying the night in my mind. Every detail, the slow wave, the neutral stare, the coded flashes, the sense of control the predator held over us without touching a finger. It was unnerving. I drove home slowly, every shadow on the road making my muscles tense. The forest lining the highway seemed to close in with every turn, each bend hiding possibilities I didn't want to consider. I realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate, and for all I knew, the predator was still out there, waiting for someone else to make a different choice, someone reckless. The night left a mark deeper than fear. It left me questioning how many people navigated life blindly, unaware that someone might be orchestrating their reactions for amusement. The lesson was bitter, but it was clear. The world could be cruelly curious, and survival often required restraint, observation, and a refusal to play into the hands of those who thrived on control. I couldn't stop thinking about the SUV, about the way it had mirrored our speed so perfectly. Over the next few days, I studied every detail I could remember. The cadence of the headlights, the lack of exhaust smell, the eerie silence that surrounded the woman. I mapped it all on paper, trying to make sense of it. Stefan watched me obsess, concerned, but I couldn't stop. I remembered stories from my father about men in the area, known for manipulating, testing, and controlling through fear. Most of them were gone now, jailed or dead, but some still lurked in rural corners, bored by ordinary life and craving something more sinister. Whoever orchestrated this encounter had a mind trained in observation and subtle intimidation. It was almost like a psychological experiment. How would we react to fear? Would we obey, flee, or confront? And the predator had learned something about us in those few minutes on the empty road. I shuddered, thinking about how many people might fail that test without even realizing it. Stefan finally broke the silence one night. "You're obsessed, Lucas. Maybe we should just forget it." I looked at him, saw his concern, and knew he was right, but I couldn't. Ignoring what happened would be dangerous. because it would leave me vulnerable. The predator's curiosity didn't end with us. It could extend to anyone who drove past those roads in the wrong way, at the wrong time. 2 weeks later, a friend called, recounting a similar encounter along a different stretch of the same road. Staged breakdown, SUV flashing lights, no resolution. My stomach sank. The pattern continued. Whoever orchestrated these events wasn't after confrontation, they were after observation, responses, and control. It was a game of human psychology played with precision. I began taking notes, recording every route I drove after dark, trying to anticipate patterns. My paranoia grew, but it was rational. I now understood the predator's rules: test, record, vanish. And in those vanished moments, decisions were being judged, measured, and cataloged. Years later, I still drive those roads cautiously, even in daylight. Stefan laughs at my obsession, but I know better. The predator may never approach us again, but the lesson lingers. Not all. Danger announces itself. Some danger is quiet, deliberate, and curious. The world is full of observers, testing reactions without revealing themselves. I remember the first time I met Meredith Crowe, like it was a scene from someone else's. Life bright, almost cinematic, yet suffocating in retrospect. It was early January in Edinburgh, winter's gray still clinging stubbornly to the streets, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee at a small cafe tucked between the old bookshops on Victoria Street. I was on the quiet side, the sort of person who noticed details most others didn't. The way people's shoes betrayed their mood, how their hands twitched when they lied. Meredith slid into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation, and she smiled as if she had known me for years. "You're Eleanor, right?" she asked. There was no hesitation, no pause to explain how she knew, just a certainty that unsettled me. I nodded cautiously. Something in her energy drew me in, even though my instincts flickered warning lights I didn't quite understand. She had this charm, effortless and confident, but it was the way she listened that was disarming, not the polite listening, but the intense, personal kind that makes you feel like every word you speak is treasured. Before I knew it, I was sharing things I rarely admitted even to myself, old regrets, fleeting fears, small embarrassments that felt larger in the shadows of winter. Meredith didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. And somehow, that combination made her the safest person in a city that had begun to feel unbearably cold. She'd respond with a quiet nod or an occasional chuckle, the kind that made you feel like you'd just passed some invisible test. By the time I left that cafe, I felt lighter, important. I didn't know that this was the moment the threads of control started weaving around me, invisible and delicate, like spider silk in the wind. It wasn't cruel yet. It was enticing. Over the next weeks, our meetings became a ritual. Coffee, walks along the water of Leith, evenings spent in her meticulously decorated flat, filled with books and subtle fragrances. She asked questions that seemed casual, but were carefully aimed to map me entirely. She remembered the tiniest details about me and others around me, things I had forgotten, and would bring them up later, almost casually, as if she had always known. I thought it was endearing. I thought it was friendship. In reality, it was an early test, a way to gauge how much I trusted her, and how easily I could be manipulated without noticing. Winter bled into early spring, and I was slipping into patterns I didn't recognize. My old friends called less frequently. I found excuses to avoid them, often citing Meredith's advice or my own need for quiet reflection. I didn't see the pattern forming, the careful isolation. She became my safe harbor, the only person I could trust, or so I thought. And in the back of my mind, that small, niggling feeling of unease. The one I had brushed off at the cafe was quietly growing, like a shadow at the edge of a candle flame. Meredith had a way of framing herself as essential, without ever demanding it outright. It was subtle, like a shift in light rather than a sudden blackout. She would casually sow tiny doubts about people in my life. "I'm not sure your friend Anna really understands what you're going through," she said one afternoon, sipping tea in her flat. "She's well-meaning, but sometimes people just don't notice when someone's struggling." I didn't argue. I found myself nodding. The seed had been planted. What I didn't notice was that these seeds weren't random. Meredith watched closely, waiting for them to grow. She would orchestrate situations to test loyalty and reactions. A joke at my expense that left me embarrassed, followed by her gentle reassurance. A minor disagreement with a coworker she had subtly nudged into existence, followed by her concern and advice. Everything was calibrated to make me dependent on her interpretation of reality. I started to see her as a guide through the fog, the only one who truly got me. I tried, at first, to resist. I met with old friends, tried to reconnect with colleagues, even attempted to distance myself subtly. But Meredith was always there, quietly observing, reminding me of things I had never consciously shared. She would recall private conversations with near-perfect accuracy, referencing details I never spoke of, moments I didn't realize I had trusted her with. It wasn't aggressive, it was almost gentle, but the effect was chilling. I began to doubt myself. How could she know? Was I forgetting things? Had I really shared that? The uncertainty tightened around me like a knot. One evening, I arrived at her flat expecting a casual visit. She opened the door with a smile that now felt different, knowing, measured. "Eleanor, I saw something you didn't," she said softly. I froze. She went on, recounting a private argument I had had with a friend, words spoken in confidence that only a handful of people knew. And she delivered it with an almost clinical calm. It wasn't anger, it was demonstration, proof that she could, and did, know everything. And suddenly, I understood this was how she held me, not with threats or violence, but with a total rewrite of reality. A silent assertion that I was never truly alone, never truly safe from her. Observation. By the time spring fully arrived, my life had narrowed dramatically. My social circles had shrunk to nearly nothing. People I had once cared for were gradually erased, either by Meredith's subtle manipulations or by my own avoidance. An unconscious obedience to the person who seemed to understand me best. I told myself it was temporary, that reconnecting was possible once I had time, but deep down I began to see a pattern. Meredith wasn't just charming, she was a strategist, careful and deliberate. Every encounter, every piece of advice, every tiny favor was calculated to ensure I depended on her alone. It wasn't obvious at first. There were moments of tenderness, of genuine friendship, or at least what I had been conditioned to believe was friendship. She celebrated my successes, comforted me during setbacks, even laughed at my jokes with the perfect rhythm. And yet, she engineered moments of conflict too. Small crises where she positioned herself as the only safe confidant. I started keeping a mental ledger, noting how quickly I ran to her when something went wrong, how much I craved her guidance. I was trapped in a web I hadn't realized I was walking into. The most unsettling moments were when I tried to reclaim some independence. I would make plans to see someone else, to attend an event, to just breathe outside her influence, and she would remind me softly, casually, devastatingly, of things only I knew. "Remember the story you told me last October? I was thinking about it the other day," she'd say. I would blanch, remembering details I hadn't thought anyone else could possibly know. And with each reminder, the invisible leash tightened. I didn't want to be controlled, but the truth was terrifying. She didn't need to force me. I was already hers. The culmination came subtly, as these things often do. One morning, a package arrived at my apartment, a small, unassuming box. Inside was a knife and a note. "You trusted me first." I stared at it for hours, the words sinking in. There was no direct threat, no promise of violence, but the implication was clear. I understood now that my safety had never been the issue. The danger was the psychological dominance, the rewriting of reality, the quiet erasure of my autonomy. Meredith had bound me, and there was no simple way to cut myself free. I don't know if the decision to leave was courageous or merely an inevitability. I began planning, quietly, methodically, knowing she would notice any overt preparation. I deleted my online presence, left messages that were intentionally misleading, and slowly removed myself from the people who could trace me. Every action was careful, every word calculated to ensure she wouldn't track me immediately. It wasn't the thrill of escape, it was survival. The night I left Edinburgh, I felt the strangest combination of relief and grief. Relief, because the weight of her observation, the constant psychological pressure, would finally ease. Grief, because even in fear, I had grown accustomed to her presence, and leaving her, cutting off the person who had dominated my life, felt like amputating a part of myself. I wondered if she knew, if she would understand, if she would ever forgive me for trying to reclaim autonomy. But I had learned something crucial. Some dangers are not physical, and some binds are far stronger than steel. I disappeared from social circles entirely. New city, new identity, new routine. The first few weeks were terrifying. Every unexpected sound or glance a potential sign of pursuit. But gradually, I felt the air clear, the pressure lift. For the first time in months, I experienced normality in its most subtle forms. Unguarded laughter, decisions made without consultation, quiet mornings without someone else's eyes on me. I had survived, not because I fought, but because I learned the rules and then rewrote them in my favor. The lesson was bitter, but essential. Control can be subtle, and the absence of violence does not mean the absence of danger. Years later, I think of Meredith less with fear than with clarity. She was not a villain in the conventional sense. There were no grand acts of brutality, no shouting or threats. She was a master of psychological precision, someone who understood the human mind's soft spots and exploited them with surgical patience. And I, naive and trusting, had walked willingly into the great labyrinth she had built around me.